A green comet burned across the stars, heading toward a frozen planet that didn't know what was coming. In the Ice Kingdom, a desperate wizard tried to stop it with a crown, and failed in a way that would echo for thousands of years. This is the entire Adventure Time timeline, from the age of magic and dinosaurs to the distant future where new heroes walk paths Finn and Jake built without knowing it. We'll move through the Mushroom War's ruins, watch kingdoms rise from candy and science, and follow one boy and his dog as they turn a broken world into something worth protecting. Whether you know every episode by heart or you're hearing the story for the first time, this documentary walks through every era, the wars that ended everything, the Ice King's tragedy, Marceline's long life, and the adventures that made Ooo feel like home. So how did a world this strange even begin? Long before the Land of Ooo had a name, before candy people walked and heroes adventured, the Earth was a different place entirely. This was the age of ancient magic, when dinosaurs still roamed, and ice stretched across vast northern territories. In this frozen world lived Urgence Evergreen, an elemental wizard of ice who watched the skies with growing dread. He wasn't alone. Other elementals ruled their domains, each wielding power over fire, candy, and slime. But Evergreen saw something the others didn't want to face, a massive comet streaking toward their planet, carrying enough force to end everything they knew. Evergreen wasn't the type to accept doom quietly. While other elementals argued or denied the threat, he worked in secret, building something that might save them all. Deep in his ice fortress, surrounded by glaciers and ancient cold, he crafted a magical crown. The design was ambitious, maybe too ambitious, a crown that could grant wishes, that could channel enough power to redirect or destroy the incoming comet. But Evergreen's plan had a flaw he didn't account for. The crown needed to be worn by someone pure of heart and clear of purpose, someone who understood exactly what they were wishing for. Evergreen had an apprentice named Gunter, a small dinosaur who followed him everywhere and absorbed his teachings. But Gunter wasn't what Evergreen thought. When the moment came and the comet drew close enough to feel its heat, Evergreen placed the crown on Gunter's head, expecting his apprentice to wish the comet away with perfect clarity. Instead, Gunter's wish reflected something else entirely, the desire to be like Evergreen himself, to embody the cold, controlling power the Ice Wizard represented. The crown twisted that wish into reality, transforming Gunter into something monstrous, something that couldn't stop the comet at all. The comet hit. The impact shook the planet to its core, creating destruction on a scale that rewrote the continents themselves. Evergreen's fortress shattered. The elementals perished or scattered. The age of ancient magic ended, in fire and ice and catastrophic force. But the crown survived, buried in frozen ruins, waiting. Its magic remained intact, still carrying that twisted wish, still ready to grant power to anyone desperate or foolish enough to put it on. This moment, this one failed attempt to save the world, planted a seed that would grow through every era that followed. The crown became a legend, a cursed artifact that promised salvation but delivered madness instead. Centuries passed, maybe millennia. The planet healed in strange ways. New life emerged from the rubble of the old world. Magic didn't disappear. It adapted, changed form, became part of the landscape itself. But that comet, and the crown it left behind, established something fundamental about this universe. Cosmic disasters weren't anomalies here. They were patterns, cycles that returned again and again. The world that would eventually be called Ooo was built on layers of apocalypse, each one leaving artifacts and mysteries for future generations to stumble into. And somewhere in the frozen north, the crown waited in the ice, patient and hungry, ready for the next person who thought they could control its power without paying the price. Fast forward through ages of recovery and regrowth to a time when Earth looked almost normal again. Cities rose, technology advanced, and humans built a civilization that seemed stable, modern, even mundane. But underneath that normalcy, tensions simmered between nations, old grudges festered, and the weapons humanity created grew more dangerous with each passing year. This era would later be called Before, a time when magic was forgotten and science ruled. When the biggest threats came from other humans, not monsters or curses, it was the last time Earth would ever feel ordinary. Then came the Mushroom War. The name itself feels almost gentle, like something from a children's rhyme, but it refers to the mushroom clouds that bloomed across the planet when nuclear weapons finally launched. Nobody living in the later eras knows exactly how it started, whether it was a calculated strike, an accident, or just the inevitable conclusion of too many weapons pointed at too many targets. What matters is that it happened, and when it did, the world ended in the most thorough way possible. Cities vaporized, continents burned. The sky filled with ash and radiation, and the survivors, those few who made it through the initial blasts, faced a planet that had fundamentally changed. The bombed-out ruins became the new landscape. Where skyscrapers once stood, now there were hollow metal skeletons reaching toward a toxic sky. Entire cities lay buried under debris and radioactive dust, their streets empty except for the wind and the distant crackling of fires that refused to die. The few humans who survived scattered into small groups, hiding in bunkers or fleeing to the edges of the devastation, trying to find clean water and untainted food. There was no government anymore, no organized response, no cavalry coming to save anyone. Just small pockets of people learning to survive in a world that no longer made sense. But the Mushroom War didn't just destroy civilization, it changed reality itself. The radiation and magical energy that had been dormant for so long began to mix, creating mutations and transformations that went far beyond simple sickness. Animals changed, plants grew in impossible ways, and from the very heart of the devastation, in the epicenter of one of the largest bomb sites, something else emerged. The Lich. He was born from the explosion itself, a skeletal being of pure malice and death, animated by the war's darkest energies. The Lich wasn't a survivor of the apocalypse. He was its physical manifestation, a creature whose only purpose was to spread extinction like gravity spreads across space. The Lich moved through the ruins with patient, inevitable menace. He didn't rage or conquer, he simply ended things. Wherever he walked, life stopped. Plants withered, animals fell dead. The few human survivors who encountered him didn't get to run or fight back. They just ceased, snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. He became the ultimate predator in a world that already felt hostile to life, and survivors learned quickly that some places on the map were forbidden, not because of radiation or lack of resources, but because death itself lived there. As decades passed, the planet began its slow, painful transformation into something new. Radioactive zones became magical badlands. Mutated creatures adapted and thrived, and humans, those who remained, either huddled in isolated communities or vanished entirely, leaving behind only artifacts and ruins as proof they'd ever existed. The world limped forward into a strange new after, where the rules of the old world no longer applied. Magic grew back in the cracks of the broken earth, responding to the void left by technology's collapse. This wasn't recovery, it was metamorphosis. And the Lich, ancient and patient, waited in the shadows of the old world, knowing that as long as life tried to rebuild, he would have a purpose. Among the scattered survivors of the Mushroom War lived a man named Simon Petrikov, a human antiquarian with glasses, a gentle demeanor, and a deep love for ancient artifacts. Before everything fell apart, Simon had been an academic, the kind of person who spent his days in museums and archives, documenting relics from past civilizations. When the bombs fell, he wasn't ready for it, nobody was, but he had something most survivors didn't, a curiosity about the past that would become both his salvation and his curse. In the wreckage of what used to be a city, Simon discovered something impossible. Hidden in the ruins of a destroyed shop or museum, the exact location lost to memory, he found the crown, Evergreen's crown, the same magical artifact that had survived the age of dinosaurs and the comet's impact, waiting through millennia for someone desperate enough to put it on. Simon didn't know its history. To him, it was just an ancient piece, possibly Scandinavian, definitely old, with strange runes he couldn't quite translate. But when the dangers of the post-war world closed in, raiders, mutated creatures, the simple threat of starvation, Simon made a choice. He put the crown on his head. The power came immediately. Ice erupted from Simon's hands, freezing threats solid, creating barriers and weapons from nothing but cold air and will. In that moment, Simon Petrikov became something more than human, something that could survive in a world actively trying to kill him. But the crown didn't grant power for free. Each time Simon used it, the magic took something in exchange, small pieces of his mind, fragments of his memory and personality. At first, the changes were subtle. He forgot small details, got confused about dates or names. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and Simon kept using the crown because the alternative was death, the transformation accelerated. Simon wasn't alone in those early days. He had Betty, his partner, a woman he loved who understood him in ways nobody else did. Betty watched Simon change with growing horror. The man she knew, kind, curious, intellectual Simon, started slipping away behind layers of icy madness. He began talking to himself, calling himself the Ice King, obsessing over strange ideas about princesses and kingdoms. Betty tried everything to help him, researching the crown, looking for ways to reverse its effects. But the post-apocalyptic world didn't have libraries or laboratories anymore. It had ruins and danger and impossible choices. Then came the moment that broke them apart. Betty was pulled into the chaos of time and dimensions, caught in magical currents that were becoming more active as the world's transformation continued. One moment she was with Simon, trying to find a cure, trying to save the man she loved. The next, she was gone, scattered across reality in ways that wouldn't become clear until much later. Simon was left alone with the crown and the growing certainty that he was losing himself. He kept using it because stopping meant dying, but each use pushed Simon further into the background and brought the Ice King further forward. Over the following years, Simon Petrikov disappeared almost completely. The Ice King took his place, a blue-skinned, white-bearded figure who lived in the Ice Kingdom and only dimly remembered being human. He built a fortress of ice and filled it with frozen decorations and imagined grandeur. He started kidnapping princesses, not out of genuine malice, but because some broken part of his mind clung to the idea that having a princess would make him complete, would fill the Betty-shaped hole he couldn't consciously remember anymore. The world around him began treating the Ice King as a joke, a nuisance villain who wasn't really dangerous, just annoying and sad in equal measure. But underneath the comedy and the goofy kidnapping schemes, a tragedy played on repeat. Simon Petrikov was still in there somewhere, trapped, watching himself become a monster he would have hated, unable to stop or escape or even fully understand what had happened to him. Around the same era, while Simon was losing himself to the crown, another survivor was learning what it meant to outlive everything you love. Marceline wasn't born during the Mushroom War, she came slightly before it, or perhaps during its earliest days. The exact timing blurred by the chaos of the era. What mattered was that she was young when the bombs fell. Young enough to need protection, but old enough to understand that the world was ending. And she was different, half-demon, with abilities that would eventually make her functionally immortal and give her a complicated relationship with what it meant to be human. Marceline's early years were defined by loss and movement. She lost people, family, friends, temporary guardians again and again. Each loss teaching her that attachment hurt, but loneliness hurt worse. She drifted through the ruins of the old world, scavenging food and shelter, learning to fight when necessary, and hide when fighting wouldn't work. The wastelands were full of dangers, mutated creatures, desperate humans, areas so toxic that even stepping into them meant death. Marceline survived through a mix of toughness, her growing powers, and a stubborn refusal to let the broken world break her completely. At some point during her wandering, young Marceline crossed paths with Simon Petrikov. This was after Simon had already begun losing himself to the crown, but before he'd completely vanished behind the Ice King persona. Simon, in his lucid moments, saw a scared kid trying to survive alone and did what he could to help. He gave her food, protection, even a stuffed animal Hambo that became one of Marceline's most treasured possessions. For a brief window of time, Simon acted as a guardian, using the crown's power to keep them both safe while fighting to maintain enough of his humanity to be kind. But Marceline had to watch Simon's transformation. She saw him use the crown more and more, saw his personality fracture and reform into something stranger and less recognizable. When Simon finally became too far gone, when the Ice King fully emerged and started acting erratic and dangerous, Marceline had to make the hard choice to leave. Not because she wanted to, but because staying meant watching someone she cared about disappear completely while being unable to stop it. So she left, carrying Hambo and the memory of Simon's kindness, and continued her long walk through the post-war world alone. Centuries passed. Marceline didn't age the way humans did. She watched the world transform from wasteland to something stranger and more magical. Communities formed and fell apart. New kingdoms began taking shape, and Marceline adapted, becoming less of a scared kid and more of a survivor with an edge. Someone who knew how to take care of herself, who learned to play music as a way of processing all that loss, who developed a sharp wit and a protective shell because showing vulnerability felt too dangerous. She moved from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots, accumulating centuries of experience and loneliness in equal measure. Eventually, during the early days of what would become the Land of Ooo, Marceline crossed paths with another survivor of history, Princess Bubblegum, Bonnibel Bubblegum, Bubblegum was in the process of building something ambitious and strange. Overhyped, the Candy Kingdom, a nation made from sentient candy people and held together by science that looked like magic. Marceline and Bubblegum connected in fits and starts, their relationship forming through shared danger and mutual respect. They helped each other, hurt each other, drifted apart, and came back together across decades and centuries. It wasn't simple or always healthy, but it was real, and it became one of the few relationships in Marceline's life that actually lasted. By the time the Land of Ooo stabilized into something resembling normal, Marceline had lived through so much loss that she'd learned to keep most people at a distance. She wasn't cruel, just guarded, carrying centuries of grief she rarely talked about. She'd become a wandering figure, sometimes a threat, sometimes a helper, always someone who remembered when the world was different. And somewhere in the Ice Kingdom, the Ice King kept kidnapping princesses and causing trouble, never remembering that he'd once saved a little girl's life, never knowing that Marceline still carried Hambo and the weight of watching Simon disappear. In the centuries following the Mushroom War, as magic seeped back into the planet's bones, a new kind of leader emerged from the chaos. Princess Bonnibel Bubblegum wasn't born into royalty, she created it, building a kingdom from scratch using a combination of scientific genius and magical experimentation that blurred the line between the two. Her people weren't humans or survivors of the old world. They were candy people, sentient beings made from sugar and chemistry, brought to life through processes that only Bubblegum fully understood. The Candy Kingdom rose from the ruins as something genuinely new, a functioning society in a world that had forgotten what society looked like. Bubblegum's approach to leadership was methodical and ambitious. She designed her citizens with specific traits. Some were guards, others were builders. Some existed primarily to farm or celebrate or keep the kingdom running. Each candy person served a purpose in her grand design. She built laboratories beneath the castle where she could continue her experiments, improving her people's durability, intelligence, and happiness. She established rules and systems, creating order in a land where chaos was still the default. To outsiders, the Candy Kingdom looked like a fairy tale, all pink towers and cheerful citizens. But underneath that sweetness ran a current of control, a leader who believed that safety required constant vigilance and careful management of every variable. The early years of the Candy Kingdom weren't peaceful. The Land of Ooo was still wild, still full of creatures and threats left over from the Mushroom War's transformations. Hungry monsters saw the candy people as literal food, raiding the kingdom's edges and trying to devour its citizens. Bubblegum responded by building walls, training guards, and creating defense systems that ranged from simple patrols to elaborate booby traps and surveillance mechanisms. She learned quickly that being a ruler meant making hard choices, when to fight, when to negotiate, when to simply eliminate threats before they reached her gates. Every attack taught her to plan better, to trust less, to prepare for worst-case scenarios. Other kingdoms began forming around the same period, each reflecting the strange new rules of this post-apocalyptic magical world. There was the Fire Kingdom, ruled by volatile flame people whose very nature made them dangerous to approach. There were various smaller principalities and territories, each with their own rulers and customs. Bubblegum interacted with these neighbors carefully, establishing trade routes and treaties while keeping detailed records of who could be trusted and who needed watching. She developed a reputation as intelligent, capable, and somewhat cold, a ruler who valued her kingdom's safety above personal warmth. During this era, the Ice King began his long pattern of princess kidnapping, and Bubblegum found herself targeted regularly. At first, these kidnappings were genuinely threatening. Being frozen and carried off to an ice fortress by a powerful wizard was serious danger. But as the incidents repeated and Bubblegum realized the Ice King wasn't actually trying to hurt her, just acting out some delusional fantasy about love and marriage, the kidnappings became more annoying than frightening. She developed contingency plans, rescue protocols, and eventually just accepted that getting kidnapped by the Ice King was part of her routine now. The residents of Ooo started treating it as normal background chaos. One more weird thing in a world full of weird things. By the time the Candy Kingdom reached stability, it stood as proof that the Land of Ooo wasn't just wasteland anymore. Life had found a way to not just survive, but thrive, building something colorful and organized on top of the old world's grave. Bubblegum's success came at a cost though, her controlling tendencies, her unwillingness to delegate real power, her habit of keeping secrets and making unilateral decisions. These traits kept her people safe, but they also set up tensions that would eventually come back to haunt her. For now, though, the Candy Kingdom was a beacon of order and science in a chaotic land, and Princess Bubblegum ruled it with brilliant, meticulous authority, always preparing for the next threat, always building better defenses, always convinced that she could engineer her way to permanent safety. While kingdoms rose and survivors adapted to the Land of Oo's strange new normal, vast forces moved beyond anyone's awareness or control. The universe hadn't forgotten about Earth. It had simply been patient, letting the planet recover and transform before the next cosmic cycle came around. Far above the atmosphere, beyond the reach of even magic, ancient patterns continued their eternal rotations. Comets returned on schedule, following orbits that predated human civilization. And inside those comets, or attached to them in ways that defied simple physics, came catalysts. Entities of pure cosmic purpose whose arrival meant change on a fundamental level. These catalysts weren't villains in any traditional sense. They didn't plan or scheme or hold grudges. They simply existed as agents of transformation, reincarnating across eons, taking different forms each time they touched the planet. Sometimes they arrived as destructive forces, sometimes as beings of potential energy, sometimes as entities that barely interacted with physical reality at all. But each arrival marked a turning point, a moment when the universe reached down and reminded everyone that the Land of Ooo, for all its local magic and kingdoms, was still part of something much larger and much stranger. One of these cosmic entities had a name that echoed through ancient history, Orgolorg, a creature of immense power who'd been defeated and diminished long before the Mushroom War, before even the Age of Evergreen. Orgolorg had been a conqueror once, a being that tried to steal power from the comets themselves and nearly succeeded before other cosmic forces struck him down. His punishment was severe. He was shrunken, weakened, and banished to Earth, where he forgot most of what he'd been. Now he existed as Gunter, one of the Ice King's pet penguins, seemingly harmless and simple, waddling around the Ice Kingdom, making cheerful wank sounds. But the power was still there, dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to wake up. On Earth itself, artifacts from every previous era lay scattered across the landscape like buried landmines of plot. The Enchiridion, an ancient magical tome containing knowledge about heroes and quests and the structure of reality, survived in various forms and locations, passed between hands that rarely understood its full significance. Portals to other dimensions existed in hidden places, caves, ruins, forgotten temples, just waiting for someone curious or desperate enough to open them. These weren't decorative mysteries. They were functional doors to places like the Crystal Dimension, the Nightosphere, and stranger realities that operated under completely different rules. The multiverse pressed against the Land of Oo's borders in ways most residents never noticed. Prismo, a wish-granting cosmic entity, existed in the time room at the center of creation, occasionally interacting with people who stumbled into his domain through lucky or unlucky accidents. Other dimensions contained their own kingdoms, heroes, and histories, some parallel to Ooo, some divergent in fundamental ways. The universe was much bigger and stranger than anyone in the Candy Kingdom or Fire Kingdom or Ice Kingdom understood, and the artifacts and portals scattered across the land were like loose threads connecting this recovering planet to an infinite tapestry of realities. This cosmic background hummed beneath everything, mostly invisible but occasionally breaking through in ways that couldn't be ignored. A demon from the Nightosphere might slip through a crack to cause trouble. An ancient evil like the Lich might wake up and threaten extinction. A comet might return and bring change nobody was ready for. The Land of Ooo existed in a permanent state of sitting on top of apocalypse leftovers, while also being watched by forces that treated entire worlds like game pieces. And nobody understood this better than the occasional adventurer who dug too deep, opened the wrong door, or asked questions about what came before and what might come next. The stage was set, not just for local heroics, but for stories that would reach across dimensions and time itself. All it needed was someone brave or foolish enough to step onto that stage and start pulling threads. Far from the cosmic background and ancient curses, in a quiet forest corner of Ooo, something simple and pure was growing. A family. Joshua and Margaret were adventurers of the legendary type, the kind of couple who'd spent decades exploring dungeons, fighting monsters, and mapping the dangerous corners of the land. They'd earned their reputation through hard-won experience, and when they finally settled down, they brought that adventurer's wisdom with them. They also brought something unexpected. 2 sons who couldn't have been more different in origin, but became inseparable in practice. The first son was a baby human, found abandoned or lost. The exact circumstances unclear, but the outcome certain. In a world where humans were nearly extinct, finding a human infant was like discovering a living fossil. Joshua and Margaret didn't hesitate. They took the baby in, named him Finn, and raised him as their own, never treating his humanity as something strange or other. To them, he was just their kid, and that was enough. Finn grew up hearing stories of dungeons and demons, learning to fight almost as soon as he could walk, absorbing the simple moral framework his parents lived by: help people, fight evil, do what's right even when it's hard. The second son was Jake, who was born a dog but discovered early on that he was anything but ordinary. Jake could stretch his body into any shape imaginable, long and thin like rope, wide and flat like a shield, compact and dense like a boulder. His powers came from a complicated origin involving a bite from a dimensional creature, but Jake's parents never made a big deal about it. To them, Jake's stretching was just another thing to work with, like Finn's determination or their own combat skills. Jake grew up goofy and confident, using his powers for pranks and practical solutions in equal measure, developing a laid-back attitude that balanced Finn's intense heroism perfectly. When Joshua and Margaret passed away, peacefully after full lives of adventure, they left their sons with more than just memories. They left them with a house and a tree, a clear sense of purpose, and the unspoken understanding that adventuring wasn't just a job. It was a way of moving through the world. Finn and Jake inherited their parents' confidence without the weight of their experience, which meant they charged into danger with pure hearts and minimal planning. They had each other, they had skills, and they had an unshakable belief that helping people was what you did with your life. The treehouse became their base of operations, a ramshackle structure built into and around a massive tree, full of random treasures, video games, and weapons collected from various adventures. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, a place where they could rest between quests, play music, cook elaborate meals, and generally live like teenage boys left unsupervised in a magical world. Jake took on a protective older brother role naturally, using his decades of stretchy experience to guide Finn through the complications of growing up. Finn, meanwhile, threw himself at every problem with absolute conviction, believing deeply that heroes could fix things if they just tried hard enough. Their early adventuring style was straightforward and enthusiastic. Someone needed help? They'd help. A monster was threatening a village? They'd fight it. A mysterious dungeon appeared? They'd explore it. Finn wore his emotions on his sleeve, treating every quest like it mattered on a cosmic scale, while Jake provided commentary, jokes, and the occasional reality check when Finn's intensity got too intense. They complemented each other perfectly. Finn's drive and Jake's ease, Finn's black and white morality, and Jake's comfortable relationship with gray areas, Finn's need to save everyone, and Jake's understanding that sometimes you just needed to take a nap and deal with things later. The Land of Ooo responded to them with the kind of casual acceptance it showed most weird things. Two brothers living in a tree and fighting random evil? Sure, why not? Nobody questioned their credentials or asked who authorized them to be heroes. In Ooo, if you were willing to help and capable of not making things worse, you were basically qualified. Finn and Jake became regular fixtures in the Candy Kingdom, known allies of Princess Bubblegum, frequent rescuers of kidnapped princesses from the Ice King, and general problem solvers for anyone who needed assistance and didn't mind that the helpers were a hyperactive human teenager and a magical dog with attachment issues and stretchy powers. This was the first time the Age of Heroes felt personal instead of historical. The first time Ooo had champions who fought because they cared, not because they were paid or obligated, and everyone sensed, without quite articulating it, that Finn and Jake's arrival marked a shift. The land had been waiting for someone like them, and now that they were here, things were going to start changing, faster. Finn and Jake's first proper adventures felt like training wheels compared to what would come later, but they established patterns and relationships that would shape everything after. The quests were smaller then, more straightforward. A candy person got stuck in a monster's lair. Finn and Jake would charge in, fight the monster, bring the citizen home. The Ice King kidnapped another princess. They'd trek to the Ice Kingdom, bust through frozen walls, carry the princess back to safety. It was hero work in its purest form, uncomplicated by moral ambiguity or personal cost, just action and consequence, problem and solution, danger and rescue. One of their earliest significant quests involved the Enchiridion, that ancient tome we mentioned before. Princess Bubblegum tasked them with retrieving it from a dungeon specifically designed to test heroes. The dungeon wasn't like the random monster lairs they'd raided before. It had structure, moral tests disguised as physical challenges. Finn had to face situations where the right choice wasn't obvious, where being a hero meant choosing between helping one person or saving many, or or trusting instinct over rule. Jake mostly stretched his way through obstacles while providing moral support. They succeeded, of course, because Finn's determination and basic decency carried him through, but the quest planted something important, the idea that heroism might be more complicated than punch evil, save good. Their interactions with Princess Bubblegum during this period were friendly and comfortable. Finn developed an obvious crush, not that he was subtle about it. He blushed when she praised him, tried extra hard on quests she assigned, and generally acted like a kid with a massive, transparent crush on someone way out of his league. Bubblegum, being centuries old and focused on running a kingdom, treated Finn's affection with gentle kindness but clear boundaries. She valued him as an ally and genuinely enjoyed having reliable heroes around, but romance wasn't on her radar. Still, this dynamic gave Finn extra motivation to be heroic, to prove himself worthy, to be the kind of person a princess might actually notice. Marceline entered their lives like weather, unpredictable and impossible to ignore. Their first encounters were tense, with Marceline testing them, pranking them, generally acting like someone who'd lived too long to take anything too seriously. She'd float into their space, drink the color red from things just to mess with them, play music that was either hauntingly beautiful or deliberately annoying. Finn initially treated her as a potential threat, another problem to solve, but Marceline's interactions revealed layers. She wasn't evil, just old, tired, and more interested in seeing how these young heroes would react to someone who didn't fit neatly into their good versus evil framework. Over time, a weird friendship formed. Marceline became someone they could turn to for help, information, or just someone who understood the land's history better than anyone except maybe the Ice King. The Ice King remained a constant, almost comical presence. His kidnapping schemes were so regular that everyone developed routines around them. Finn and Jake would get the distress call, journey to the Ice Kingdom, fight through ice monsters and frozen traps, find the princess, dodge the Ice King's ice magic, and carry her home. The Ice King would rant about wanting a wife, about being lonely, about how they just didn't understand his feelings. Finn and Jake treated him like an annoyance, a weird uncle who needed to be stopped but not seriously hurt. Nobody looked deeper than the surface comedy. Nobody asked why a powerful wizard spent his time on these pathetic romantic gestures. The tragedy was right there in the open, but it was easier to laugh than to confront the sad truth underneath. Through these early adventures, Finn started noticing patterns that didn't quite fit his simple hero narrative. Some monsters had reasons for their actions. Some evil creatures were just scared or hungry. The Ice King was dangerous, but also pathetic in ways that made Finn uncomfortable. Marceline did genuinely scary things, but also saved them when it mattered. And Ooo itself kept revealing that under every silly quest was usually some ancient magic or leftover apocalypse artifact, reminders that this cheerful land was built on graves and ruins. Finn still charged forward with absolute conviction, still believed in right and wrong, still wanted to save everyone. But small doubts began forming, tiny questions about whether being a hero was as simple as his parents had made it sound. Jake, meanwhile, was learning his own lessons about responsibility and attachment. He started dating Lady Rainicorn, a rainbow-colored flying unicorn who spoke Korean and embodied everything graceful that Jake wasn't. Their relationship introduced Jake to the idea that maybe he wanted more than just adventure and hanging out with his brother. Maybe he wanted partnership, family, a future that looked different from his past. He didn't lose his goofiness or his loyalty to Finn, but he started seeing himself as someone who could have multiple important relationships, multiple roles beyond Finn's brother and backup. By the end of this early stretch, Finn and Jake had become fixtures of the Land of Ooo, heroes people called when danger appeared, friends Princess Bubblegum relied on, regular thorns in the Ice King's side. They'd saved dozens of lives, explored countless dungeons, fought monsters whose names they barely remembered. The treehouse filled with trophies and weird artifacts they didn't fully understand. And beneath all the action and adventure, Ooo hummed with the sense that these early quests were just prologue, that the real tests were still coming, that every ancient door Finn and Jake opened was revealing more complicated truths about the land they called home and the forces that shaped it long before they existed. The Land of Ooo had known monsters, villains, and threats of every variety, but nothing prepared it for the Lich's return. This wasn't the first time the ancient being of death had stirred. His origins reached back to the Mushroom War itself, born from the bomb's darkest energies. But this time felt different. This time, the Lich came with purpose and clarity, moving through the land not as a wandering force but as an intelligence with a goal: to extinguish all life, to complete what the bombs had started, to render the universe silent and empty. When Finn and Jake first encountered him properly, not just as a legend or a distant threat, but as a present, immediate danger, they realized they were facing something fundamentally different from the Ice King's goofy schemes or random dungeon monsters. The Lich's physical form was a nightmare, made solid, a skeletal figure in tattered robes, green flame burning in empty eye sockets, voice like grinding stone and final breaths. When he spoke, reality seemed to darken around his words. He didn't threaten or boast like a normal villain. He simply stated his purpose with the confidence of gravity, explaining why things fall. Life was an error to be corrected. The universe would be better as nothing, and he had the power to make it happen, to spread death like it was weather, unavoidable and absolute. This was the first time Finn encountered evil that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be reformed, couldn't be anything except opposed with everything he had. The Lich's plan involved ancient artifacts and dimensional portals, specifically the Enchiridion that Finn had recovered earlier. The tome wasn't just a hero's guidebook, it contained secrets about the structure of reality, including instructions for opening portals to other dimensions. The Lich needed these portals, needed to reach the time room where Prismo existed, where wishes could be made and unmade. If he could access that cosmic space, he could wish for the extinction of all life across all dimensions, completing his purpose on a scale that made the Mushroom War look small. Finn and Jake pursued him through the Candy Kingdom's darker corners, through ancient underground ruins where the bombs had left their deepest scars, chasing a being who didn't run but simply moved with patient, terrible certainty toward his goal. The battle inside the Candy Kingdom became urgent and desperate in ways Finn hadn't experienced before. The Lich possessed people, turning Princess Bubblegum herself into his puppet, using her voice and form to manipulate situations. Finn had to fight someone who looked like his friend, had to make the terrible choice between stopping the Lich and protecting Bubblegum's body. Jake stretched to his absolute limits, creating barriers and weapons from his own flesh, pushing his powers further than comfort allowed. The Candy Kingdom's citizens fled in panic as their princess moved with dead eyes and spoke with the Lich's grinding voice, commanding them to submit to extinction like it was the most natural thing in the world. The possessed Bubblegum led the Lich to hidden places beneath the kingdom, ancient chambers left over from pre-war civilizations, places where the fabric between dimensions wore thin. Down in those dark spaces, surrounded by crumbling concrete and radioactive symbols from the old world, the Lich began his ritual. He used the Enchiridion as a key, speaking words and languages older than the Mushroom War, older than human civilization, maybe older than the planet itself. The portal began opening, not all at once but in stages, reality peeling back like skin to reveal something beneath that hurt to look at directly. Finn threw himself at the Lich repeatedly, trying every fighting technique his parents had taught him, every trick he'd learned from years of adventuring. Nothing worked. The Lich wasn't just stronger, he existed on a different level entirely, a being of pure purpose who couldn't be distracted or hurt by physical attacks. When Finn punched him, his fists connected with bone that felt like stone, ancient and unmovable. When Jake wrapped around him trying to restrain him, the Lich simply continued moving, dragging Jake along like he weighed nothing. And through it all, that voice kept grinding out explanations, telling them why their resistance was pointless, why life was temporary and death was patient, and the outcome was already determined. Princess Bubblegum, trapped inside her own body during the possession, fought back from within. Her scientific mind worked even while the Lich controlled her movements, searching for weaknesses in his hold, looking for the moment when his attention might slip enough for her to reclaim control. When that moment came, brief, measured in heartbeats, she managed to speak one word of warning before the Lich crushed her consciousness back down. But that one word gave Finn the information he needed. The Lich's weakness, if it could be called that, was his single-minded focus. He didn't adapt or strategize. He simply pushed toward his goal, assuming nothing could actually stop him. The breakthrough came through a combination of Finn's desperation and ancient magic they barely understood. In the chamber where the Lich was opening his portal, there existed defensive mechanisms built by people who'd worried about exactly this kind of threat. Finn activated these mechanisms by accident, by throwing himself at ancient controls, trying anything that might help. Sweeter than sweet guardian blood, a substance the old world survivors had created to fight death magic, flooded into the chamber. It wasn't enough to kill the Lich. Maybe nothing could kill him, but it was enough to break his possession of Bubblegum and weaken him at a crucial moment. When the Lich reached for the portal, ready to step through to Prismo's time room and make his wish for universal extinction, Finn did something reckless and brave and terrifying. He jumped into the portal first, grabbing onto the Lich as they both tumbled through dimensional space. Jake followed because that's what Jake did, because leaving Finn alone was never an option, even when the destination was literally unknown. They fell through colors and geometries that shouldn't exist, through spaces between spaces, landing somewhere that wasn't quite the time room but close to it, a place where reality's rules were suggestions rather than laws. The struggle continued in this in-between space, with Finn and Jake trying desperately to stop the Lich from reaching Prismo, while the Lich continued forward with mechanical certainty. They fought across surfaces that were and weren't solid, through areas where time moved sideways, in spaces where breathing was optional and gravity was decorative. The Lich's physical form started breaking down from the dimensional stress, pieces of his ancient body cracking and reforming, but his purpose never wavered. He would reach Prismo, he would make his wish, he would end everything. Prismo himself appeared at the worst possible moment, his two-dimensional pink form materializing on a wall that served as the entrance to the time room proper. He saw the Lich approaching and understood immediately what was happening. A being of pure death and extinction was about to ask for the one wish that could actually end all life across all dimensions. Prismo couldn't refuse wishes. That wasn't how his existence worked. If the Lich reached him and made the wish correctly, Prismo would be cosmically obligated to grant it, no matter how catastrophic the consequences. Finn grabbed the Lich's arm bone with both hands, his whole body weight pulling against the skeletal being's forward momentum. Jake stretched around them both, trying to create enough resistance to slow the Lich down, to buy time for something or someone to help. But the Lich was stronger, was always going to be stronger, and Finn felt himself losing the struggle, felt his grip slipping, felt the terrible certainty that he was about to watch the universe end because he wasn't powerful enough to stop it. This wasn't like fighting the Ice King or rescuing princesses. This was realizing that some evil was bigger than heroism, that some threats required more than courage and determination. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Another being tumbled through the portal behind them, someone who'd been following the chaos, someone who understood dimensional mechanics better than Finn or Jake. The details blurred in the moment's desperation, but the result was clear. The Lich was stopped, sealed, contained, before he could reach Prismo and make his extinction wish. The skeletal being was imprisoned in amber-like magical substance, frozen in the moment of reaching forward, his green eye flame still burning with patient malevolence. He wasn't destroyed, maybe he couldn't be destroyed, but he was removed from the board, prevented from completing his purpose. When reality stabilized enough for Finn and Jake to return to Ooo, they found the Candy Kingdom in chaos. The Lich's brief possession of their princess had left citizens traumatized and confused. Buildings showed damage from the battles fought in streets and corridors, and Princess Bubblegum herself, freed from the possession, was dealing with the violation of having something ancient and evil wear her body like a suit. She remembered everything the Lich had made her do, every word he'd spoken through her mouth, every movement he'd controlled. The experience left her shaken in ways she rarely showed, and her immediate response was to lock herself in her laboratory and begin designing new defenses, new security measures, new ways to prevent anything from ever possessing her or infiltrating her kingdom again. Finn sat outside Bubblegum's lab that first night after, just sitting with his back against the wall, too tired to move but too wired to sleep. Jake brought him food that Finn didn't eat. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They'd faced the Lich and barely survived, had seen what real evil looked like when it wasn't complicated by tragedy or misunderstanding. The Lich didn't have a sad backstory that explained his actions. He wasn't a victim of circumstance or a good person corrupted. He was just death, pure and simple, existence's opposite made conscious and given purpose. The experience changed Finn's understanding of heroism fundamentally. Before the Lich, he'd believed that courage and determination could overcome anything, that being good and trying hard was enough to win. The Lich proved otherwise. Some evils were bigger than any individual hero. Some threats required luck and help and intervention from forces beyond mortal control. Finn had thrown everything he had at the Lich, and it hadn't been enough. He'd needed help, needed last-minute saves, needed the universe to bend in his favor just to survive, let alone win. That realization sat uncomfortable in his chest. Not because it made him want to quit being a hero, but because it meant accepting that heroism had limits, that sometimes survival was the only victory possible. Jake processed it differently, turning inward in ways he usually avoided. He'd been scared. Genuinely, deeply frightened, in ways he rarely admitted. Scared not just of dying, but of the idea that everything might end, that all the people he loved, and the puppies he'd just had, and Lady Rainicorn and Finn, and every person in Ooo might just cease to exist because one skeletal being, with infinite patience, decided it should be that way. Jake's usual philosophy was that everything would work out if you stayed relaxed and rolled with life's punches. The Lich challenged that philosophy by presenting a problem that couldn't be rolled with, a punch aimed at existence itself. Jake came through it more cautious, more aware that the universe contained forces that didn't care about his laid-back attitude. The Candy Kingdom's recovery took weeks. Citizens who'd seen the Lich struggled to return to normal routines. Parents held their candy children closer, afraid of threats they couldn't understand. Banana guards stood watch with more vigilance than usual, though what they'd do if something like the Lich returned was unclear. Princess Bubblegum implemented her new security measures despite protests from those who felt she was overreacting. Surveillance increased, defensive systems strengthened, protocols established for threats of different categories. She'd been violated, her kingdom had been invaded by something worse than any army, and she would never let it happen again if preparation and planning could prevent it. Finn and Jake returned to the treehouse carrying the weight of what they'd faced. The Lich was contained but not destroyed, sealed but not truly defeated. Somewhere in that amber prison, green flames still burned in empty eye sockets, and the being of pure death waited with the patience of extinction itself. Because death never truly loses, it just waits. Time delivers everything to its door eventually, and the Lich had infinite time. The heroes had won this round by the narrowest margin, but the war between life and extinction hadn't ended. It had just paused, and everyone involved understood that it would resume eventually, in some form, in some era, when the seals weakened, or new doors opened, or the universe's cycle brought death back around to try again. After cosmic threats and death incarnate, Finn's attention turned to something equally terrifying in completely different ways: feelings. This stretch of his life wasn't about saving the world or fighting ancient evil, it was about navigating the messy, painful territory of crushes, relationships, and the discovery that you could hurt people without meaning to, sometimes more deeply than any villain could. The individual episodes during this period varied in importance. Some were crucial character moments, others were lighter adventures that gave everyone room to breathe after the Lich's intensity. But the emotional pattern they created mattered more than any single quest. Finn's crush on Princess Bubblegum continued burning bright and obvious, this earnest teenage longing for someone who saw him as a dear friend and valuable ally, but nothing more. He tried expressing his feelings in various ways: heroic gestures, gifts, attempts at impressive feats, but Bubblegum handled each attempt with gentle kindness and clear boundaries. She valued Finn enormously, trusted him with dangerous quests, relied on him to protect the Candy Kingdom, but romance wasn't something she felt toward him. The rejection wasn't cruel or dramatic, it was just clear, stated in ways that left no room for misinterpretation, but also didn't mock his feelings. Finn tried taking it well, tried being mature and understanding about the whole situation. He told himself and Jake that he was fine, that he respected Bubblegum's feelings, that being friends was enough. But underneath the heroic exterior was a kid who'd built up someone in his head as perfect and attainable, who'd convinced himself that being brave and heroic would naturally lead to romance, and who was now dealing with the reality that life didn't work that way. The hurt was private and genuine, the kind that doesn't get solved by punching monsters or exploring dungeons. Jake watched his brother process this rejection with protective concern, offering advice that ranged from genuinely helpful to completely ridiculous, mostly just trying to be there, while Finn figured out how to separate his identity as a hero from his worth as a potential romantic partner. During the same period, smaller adventures continued at their normal pace. The Ice King kidnapped another princess. This time it was Wildberry Princess, or maybe Muscle Princess. The specific target didn't matter as much as the routine itself. Finn and Jake responded out of habit more than urgency, trekking to the Ice Kingdom through snow and ice, fighting through the Ice King's frozen defenses, listening to his delusional rants about love and marriage. But something felt different this time. After learning about Simon's tragedy, after understanding that the Ice King was a victim trapped inside his own survival mechanism, the whole kidnapping routine felt sadder and more uncomfortable. Finn still saved the princess because that's what heroes did, but his heart wasn't fully in it. He couldn't just see the Ice King as a joke villain anymore, and that complicated everything. Enter Flame Princess, a being of literal fire from the Fire Kingdom, dangerous and powerful and complicated, in ways that made Bubblegum's calm intelligence feel safe by comparison. Finn first encountered her during a mission that involved the Fire Kingdom's volatile politics and its paranoid ruler. Flame Princess couldn't touch most people without burning them. Her emotions were tied directly to her powers. Anger meant explosions, sadness meant burning tears. Happiness meant uncontrolled flames that could spread to anything combustible. She'd been imprisoned by her own father, raised to believe she was too dangerous for the world, told that her nature was a curse, and that caring about anyone would only lead to destruction. When Finn met her and saw past the danger to the person underneath, when he genuinely liked her for who she was, and not because she fit some princess fantasy, something real sparked between them. Flame Princess was used to fear and rejection, to people treating her like a weapon or a disaster waiting to happen. Finn treated her like a person who happened to be made of fire, someone interesting and worth knowing rather than something to be avoided or controlled. His approach was refreshingly simple. He thought she was cool, wanted to spend time with her, and didn't let the practical problems of her literally burning nature stop him from trying. Their early interactions were awkward in the way all early relationships are, but amplified by the fact that physical contact could result in severe burns. Finn wore protective suits made from flame-resistant materials. They went on dates that involved Finn standing at safe distances or using creative solutions to interact without touching. Flame Princess, meanwhile, was learning that not everyone feared her, that her power didn't automatically make her a monster, that being dangerous and being evil weren't the same thing. She started opening up about her imprisonment, her father's control, her confusion about what she was supposed to be beyond just a potential threat. Jake supported the relationship while also worrying constantly. Dating someone made of fire introduced practical problems that normal relationships didn't face. But he also saw that Finn seemed genuinely happy in ways he hadn't been during the bubblegum crush. This felt mutual, real, like both people were choosing each other rather than one person, pining after someone out of reach. Lady Rainicorn offered advice from her own perspective, having dated Jake despite the species' differences and cultural gaps. The message was consistent. Relationships required work and understanding, but they were possible even when the logistics seemed impossible. As Finn and Flame Princess spent more time together, they went on actual adventures as partners. They fought monsters side by side, with Flame Princess's fire powers, complementing Finn's sword skills in ways that made them an effective team. They explored dungeons together, solved puzzles, protected civilians from various threats. Finn felt like maybe he'd found something genuine, something that wasn't just hero worship or distant longing, but actual mutual connection. Flame Princess felt like maybe she could be close to someone without destroying them, that her father had been wrong about her being too dangerous for relationships. But Finn made mistakes. Significant relationship-ending mistakes born from immaturity and the same impulsive nature that served him well in fights but failed completely in personal situations. He manipulated situations to see how Flame Princess would react, treating her emotions like experiments rather than respecting them as real feelings. In one particularly bad choice, he set up a fight between Flame Princess and the Ice King just to see what would happen, treating the battle like entertainment rather than recognizing the genuine danger and emotional weight for everyone involved. The Ice King could have been seriously hurt. Flame Princess could have lost control completely. And Finn watched it all like it was a game, not fully processing that these were people with real stakes and real pain. The manipulation came from complicated places, partly Finn trying to understand his own feelings, partly him testing whether Flame Princess was too dangerous the way her father claimed, partly just teenage thoughtlessness that didn't consider consequences beyond immediate curiosity. But the impact was real and serious. When Flame Princess discovered what Finn had done, overhearing him talk about it, or seeing evidence of his manipulation, she felt betrayed in ways that went beyond simple anger. She trusted him, opened up despite her father's warnings that people would fear or use her, and Finn had proven those warnings partially right by treating her feelings and her power as things to experiment with rather than respect. The breakup was explosive in every sense. Flame Princess's emotions overwhelmed her control, manifesting as actual fire and destruction as she processed the betrayal. Buildings burned, the area around them scorched. Finn stood in the midst of it, trying to apologize, trying to explain, but explanations couldn't undo what he'd done. Flame Princess told him he was not good, which hit Finn harder than any physical attack could have. His entire identity was built around being good, being a hero, helping people. Hearing someone he cared about say he wasn't good shattered something fundamental in his self-image. The aftermath left Finn processing multiple painful truths at once. Being a hero didn't make you good at relationships. Saving someone's life didn't mean you knew how to respect their heart. Good intentions didn't excuse harmful actions. These lessons couldn't be learned by fighting monsters or exploring dungeons. They required sitting with discomfort, accepting responsibility, understanding that impact mattered more than intentions. Jake tried to help Finn process everything, offering brotherly support while also being honest that Finn had screwed up significantly. Lady Rainicorn had perspectives too, having watched the whole situation unfold with growing concern. Flame Princess returned to the Fire Kingdom changed by the experience. She'd learned that opening up to people could lead to genuine pain, but also that she was capable of relationships, that her nature wasn't the insurmountable curse her father claimed. She began taking more control of her own life and her kingdom's politics, challenging her father's authority, proving that she could be powerful and dangerous, while also being thoughtful and controlled. The relationship with Finn was over, but the growth it sparked continued. She became a ruler in her own right, respected and slightly feared, someone who understood her power and didn't apologize for it, but also didn't let it define her completely. The Fire Kingdom itself became more visible in Oo's political landscape through these events. Its volatile nature, its rulers' paranoia, the way fire people expressed emotions, all of this became relevant beyond just background lore. The kingdom's relationship with other kingdoms remained tense, with everyone aware that fire citizens could be dangerous if provoked or if they lost emotional control. But they were also genuine people with complex lives, not just walking disasters. This era helped establish that Oo's kingdoms had real political dynamics, genuine tensions based on culture and power and history, not just simple good versus evil alignments. Meanwhile, Jake's personal life was evolving in parallel. Lady Rainicorn's pregnancy was progressing rapidly. Rainbow unicorn dog hybrid biology apparently didn't follow standard timelines. Jake was excited and terrified in equal measure, realizing that fatherhood meant responsibilities he'd never had to consider before. His own father, Joshua, had been confident and capable, always knowing what to do in dangerous situations. Jake worried he wouldn't measure up, that he'd be too lazy or immature to be a good dad. But when the puppies arrived, 5 rainbow-colored stretchy hybrids who grew alarmingly fast, Jake discovered that fatherhood wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, being present, loving your kids even when you had no idea what you were doing. The puppies changed the dynamic at the treehouse. Suddenly there were kids around, little beings who needed attention and teaching and protection. Finn became Uncle Finn, a role he took seriously, teaching the puppies heroic values and how to fight. Jake balanced time between adventuring with Finn and being present for his family, discovering that you could love multiple people intensely without diminishing any single relationship. Lady Rainicorn managed the impossible task of keeping 5 hyper-powered children from burning down or stretching apart the family home, all while maintaining her grace and patience. Through all of this personal upheaval, smaller adventures continued. Finn and Jake helped various citizens with various problems. They explored new dungeons, fought new monsters, uncovered ancient artifacts that turned out to be dangerous or useless in equal measure. These adventures felt different now though, less like pure fun and more like processing ground between emotional crises. Finn was changing, growing up in ways that hurt and felt awkward, learning that being a teenager meant dealing with feelings that didn't have clear solutions, that couldn't be resolved with courage and a sword. The era ended with Finn emotionally bruised but wiser, Jake adjusting to fatherhood while still being Finn's partner, and the relationships in their lives more complicated but also more real than before. The treehouse remained their base, but it felt different now, less like a clubhouse for teenage heroes, and more like a home where complicated people dealt with complicated feelings between adventures. Finn had learned that you could hurt people without swinging a sword, that intentions didn't excuse impact, that being brave in battle didn't translate to being emotionally intelligent in relationships. The lessons came without clear resolutions or happy endings. They came with apologies that couldn't fully repair damage, with growth that felt slow and painful, with understanding that some mistakes changed relationships permanently. And the land kept spinning forward, indifferent to teenage heartbreak, ready to throw new challenges whether they'd finished processing the old ones or not. The universe expanded dramatically when Finn and Jake stumbled into Prismo's domain, a discovery that changed their understanding of reality in fundamental ways. Prismo existed outside normal space and Tarzan in time, a cosmic wish-granting entity who lived in the time room, at the center of everything, sleeping and dreaming and occasionally making wishes come true for people who managed to find him. The room itself was impossible, a space that existed between dimensions, decorated casually like someone's apartment, but functioning as the hub from which all realities branched. Prismo appeared as a two-dimensional projection on a wall, all pink and friendly, speaking like a laid-back guy you might meet at a party, except he could literally rewrite existence if he felt like it. Meeting Prismo introduced Finn and Jake to concepts they'd never seriously considered before. Multiple timelines existed simultaneously, branching off from key decisions and moments, creating alternate versions of everyone and everything. Every significant choice created a fork in reality where both outcomes happened, just in different dimensions. Wishes could reshape reality, but they followed rules. Be specific, understand what you're actually asking for, accept that every wish has consequences that ripple outward in ways you can't predict. The universe was much bigger and much stranger than two brothers from a treehouse had ever imagined, and Prismo sat at its center like a cosmic DJ mixing realities. Prismo himself was surprisingly chill about his cosmic importance. He genuinely liked Finn and Jake, treated them like friends rather than cosmic annoyances or mortals beneath his notice. His loneliness was obvious to anyone paying attention. Existing outside time meant existing outside normal relationships, watching beings live and die and change while he remained static, eternal, isolated. When Finn and Jake showed up and just treated him like a person worth hanging out with, Prismo responded with genuine affection. He offered them pickles, told them about the structure of reality like it was casual conversation, and seemed genuinely happy to have company that didn't want anything except to spend time with him. But the friendship led to complications almost immediately. The Lich, that being of pure death they'd fought before, wasn't as contained as everyone hoped. Through manipulation, dimensional awareness, and patience that measured itself in eons, the Lich had found a way to reach toward Prismo again. This time his approach was more subtle, not a direct assault, but manipulation of cosmic rules, using wishes and loopholes to create situations where he could slip through reality's defenses. When Finn and Jake learned that the Lich was making another attempt at universal extinction, they knew they had to act, even though dealing with cosmic-level threats felt far beyond their abilities as heroes. The crisis involved wish magic going wrong in complicated ways. Someone made a wish, the details tangled in cosmic bureaucracy and dimensional mechanics, that had unintended consequences across multiple timelines. The Lich had positioned himself to take advantage of these consequences, to slip through the cracks created by reality bending itself to accommodate the wish. Finn and Jake found themselves thrust into the role of cosmic janitors, trying to clean up a mess that existed across dimensions, trying to stop a being of extinction who understood the multiverse better than they understood their own neighborhood. Prismo explained the situation in his characteristically casual way, describing how timelines worked and why this particular problem was serious. In the main timeline, the one Finn and Jake called home, Simon Petrikov had put on the crown during the Mushroom War and survived by becoming the Ice King. But wishes had created instabilities, and one of those instabilities had solidified into a full alternate reality where Simon's choice went differently. In this other timeline, Farmworld, Simon had made a sacrifice that prevented the Mushroom War's worst devastation, but also prevented his own survival in the way Ooo timeline Simon survived. The result was a world that looked more like old Earth, more human and rural, but still scarred by the near apocalypse. Traveling to Farmworld required passing through dimensional barriers that felt physically uncomfortable, reality pressing against them from wrong angles, colors that didn't exist in normal space bleeding into their vision. When they arrived, the immediate difference was obvious. This world had more humans, more technology that looked recognizably Earth-like rather than magically twisted, fewer obvious magical elements. Buildings were mostly intact if weathered. Roads still existed. The apocalypse had touched this place but hadn't transformed it into the magical weirdness that defined Ooo. It looked like what Earth might have become if recovery had gone differently, if magic hadn't rushed in to fill the spaces left by human civilization's collapse. Meeting Farmworld Finn was deeply unsettling for the real Finn. This alternate version of himself looked similar. Same age, same basic appearance, but everything else was different. Farmworld Finn lived as a simple farmer, working land and taking care of his mother, dealing with the practical problems of survival in a dangerous but not magical world. He had a mechanical arm, lost to some past injury that nobody discussed in detail. He'd never known adventure in the heroic sense, never explored dungeons, never saved princesses, never thought of himself as special or destined for anything beyond getting through each day and protecting the people he loved. The contrast forced uncomfortable questions. Was being a hero something inherent to who Finn was? Some essential quality that would manifest regardless of circumstances? Or was it just the result of being raised by adventurers in a magical land where heroics were possible and encouraged? Farmworld Finn provided a clear answer. In different circumstances, with different guardians and different world rules, Finn became someone completely different. Not better or worse, just different. The realization shook main timeline Finn's understanding of himself, made him wonder if his heroic identity was meaningful or just environmental conditioning. Jake processed the alternate timeline differently, seeing Farmworld as interesting but not personally threatening. He was still himself, still stretchy, still Jake, regardless of timeline. But he watched Finn struggle with the implications and worried about his brother's tendency to overthink things. Jake's philosophy was simpler. They lived in the timeline they lived in, so worrying about what they might have been in other realities was pointless. But he understood why Finn couldn't let it go, why seeing yourself as someone fundamentally different was existentially challenging in ways that didn't have easy solutions. The actual threat in Farmworld revolved around the crown again, because of course it did. That cursed artifact echoed through every timeline, always dangerous, always corrupting. In this world, the crown had been frozen along with a nuclear bomb at the moment Simon used its power to prevent the Mushroom War's completion. The crown and bomb had remained suspended in ice for decades, a monument to the apocalypse that almost was, and a warning about the apocalypse that still could be. But now something was disturbing that frozen status quo, threatening to release both the crown's madness and the bomb's destruction. If both were freed, Farmworld would experience the full devastation that Ooo timeline had survived centuries ago. Finn and Jake worked with Farmworld Finn to contain the threat, creating an odd team of alternate selves and stretchy dogs trying to prevent an apocalypse. Farmworld Finn was cautious and practical, worried about his mother and community, not naturally heroic, but willing to do what needed doing. Main Finn kept trying to inspire his alternate self to bring out the heroism he was sure existed inside every version of himself. But Farmworld Finn just wanted to survive and protect his family. He wasn't interested in grand heroic gestures or destiny. The mission became as much about Finn accepting that other versions of himself didn't need to be heroes, as it was about stopping the crown and bomb. The crown itself, when they reached it, was surrounded by ice and radiation both, glowing with that familiar sickly light that meant twisted wish magic. They could see Simon's frozen form inside, or what remained of it, the moment of his sacrifice preserved like an insect in amber. Farmworld had its own version of Marceline, older and more weathered a bit, who showed up because she remembered Simon and felt protective even after all these years. This Marceline had never been a vampire, had survived through toughness alone, but she still carried that same ancient sadness, that weight of living through eras while everyone you knew disappeared. The crisis escalated when the crown's magic started leaking, affecting Farmworld Finn in ways that mirrored what happened to Simon. The crown called to him, promised power and safety, whispered solutions to his problems. For terrifying minutes, main timeline Finn watched his alternate self struggle with the same temptation Simon had faced, saw what might happen if Farmworld Finn put on the crown and became something other than human. The parallel was too clear to ignore. Simon had made a choice during desperation, and that choice had destroyed him. Now, Farmworld Finn stood at a similar crossroads, and the universe waited to see if this timeline would repeat the same tragedy. Jake intervened at the crucial moment, talking Farmworld Finn down from putting on the crown, using practical logic and emotional honesty instead of heroic speeches. He explained what the crown had done to Simon in their timeline, how it twisted minds and destroyed identity, how power wasn't worth that cost. Farmworld Finn listened because Jake wasn't trying to inspire him or appeal to heroism. Jake was just explaining consequences like one reasonable person to another. The crown remained untouched, the temptation resisted, the cycle potentially broken. Containing the crown and bomb required creative solutions involving ice and dimensional barriers and magic they barely understood. Prismo provided guidance from outside the timeline, his cosmic perspective allowing him to see solutions that were invisible to people trapped in linear time. They managed to reseal both threats, preventing the Farmworld apocalypse, but knowing the seal was temporary, that eventually this timeline wished it would have to deal with its frozen dangers again. It wasn't a perfect solution, but perfect solutions rarely existed when dealing with artifacts as cursed as Evergreen's crown. When Finn and Jake returned to their own timeline, the experience sat heavy between them. They'd visited a world where everything familiar appeared in altered form, where people they knew had lived completely different lives, where Finn himself existed as someone who'd never become a hero. The philosophical weight was substantial. If Finn could be happy and good as a simple farmer, what did that say about his heroic identity? If his adventures, and his courage, and his entire sense of self were just products of circumstance rather than essential qualities, did his life mean what he thought it meant? Jake offered his perspective during the quiet trip home. It didn't matter what other Finns in other timelines were like, because this Finn was the one who actually existed in their world, who'd made the choices that led to this moment, who'd built relationships and saved lives and mattered to people and in this specific timeline. Alternate possibilities were interesting but irrelevant to the actual life being lived. Finn was a hero because he chose to be, kept choosing it every day, and that choice was meaningful regardless of whether other versions of him made different choices. Jake's philosophy wasn't complex, but it helped ground Finn when existential questions threatened to overwhelm practical living. Prismo remained a friend after this crisis, someone Finn and Jake visited occasionally when they needed cosmic perspective or just wanted to hang out with someone who understood reality's bigger picture. Prismo valued their friendship deeply, and they realized, over time, that their casual acceptance of him mattered more than they'd understood. Cosmic beings didn't get many genuine friendships. Most people either feared them or wanted something from them. Finn and Jake just liked Prismo, enjoyed spending time with him, treated him like a person rather than a cosmic dispenser of wishes and knowledge. That simple friendship created a bond that would prove important in later crises, when having an ally outside normal space-time became unexpectedly crucial. The Farmworld incident left scars on reality that wouldn't manifest fully until much later. Timelines had touched, energies had mixed, and the boundaries between what was and what could have been had thinned. The multiverse was vast and mostly stable, but every time someone traveled between timelines or made wishes that affected multiple realities, the fabric strained a little more. The universe had patterns and rules, and when those rules were bent too often, consequences accumulated like interest on a cosmic debt. Finn and Jake couldn't see these consequences yet. They were too busy being relieved that Farmworld hadn't exploded, and that they were back home where things made familiar sense. But the universe had taken note of them, these heroes who could traverse timelines and interact with cosmic entities, and that attention would bring both opportunities and dangers in the eras to come. For Finn's entire life, his human origins had been a mystery he'd accepted without questioning too hard. He knew he was adopted, knew Joshua and Margaret had found him and raised him as their own, knew humans were rare enough in Ooo that finding another one was basically impossible. The questions about where he came from, who his biological parents were, what happened to the humans, these had been background curiosities, important but not urgent compared to daily adventures and immediate problems. Then Martin appeared, and suddenly Finn's past became present in the worst possible way, forcing him to confront what it meant to want family versus what family actually gave you. Martin's appearance wasn't some heartwarming reunion arranged by fate or destiny. He showed up as a prisoner, a criminal being held for various crimes across the cosmos, someone who'd been running scams and cons and generally living as a selfish drifter through multiple worlds and space stations. The cosmic prison where he was being held looked like bureaucracy mixed with impossible architecture, a place where beings from different realities were contained together without regard for their individual circumstances or backgrounds. When Finn learned through complicated channels involving Prismo and cosmic record-keeping that Martin was his biological father, his first reaction was hope. Pure, unguarded hope that maybe his dad was secretly good, maybe there was a heroic reason he'd been absent, maybe this would fill something Finn hadn't realized was empty until now. That hope lasted approximately as long as it took to actually talk to Martin and realize what kind of person he was. Martin wasn't evil in the dramatic way the Lich was evil. He wasn't trying to end all life, or conquer kingdoms, or spread death across dimensions. He was just selfish in the banal, everyday way that normal people can be selfish, unwilling to sacrifice comfort for others, incapable of putting his son's needs above his own desires. Where Finn helped people instinctively, Martin looked for angles and escapes. Where Finn charged at danger, Martin ran from responsibility. Where Finn valued honesty and connection, Martin valued freedom and self-preservation above everything else, including relationships with people who should have mattered. Their first conversations were awkward and painful in ways Finn had never experienced before. Martin wasn't interested in getting to know his son or building a relationship. He was interested in escaping prison and getting back to whatever scams he'd been running before getting caught. When Finn tried to connect, tried to find common ground, or ask about his mother, or understand why he'd been separated from his biological family as an infant, Martin deflected or gave vague answers that felt like lies even when they were technically true. His body language screamed discomfort, like being around his own child was an obligation he resented rather than an opportunity he valued. Jake watched this unfold with growing anger and protective instinct. He could see through Martin immediately. Jake understood people in ways Finn sometimes didn't, could read selfishness and dishonesty from a mile away, but he held back from intervening too aggressively because he knew Finn needed to process this his own way, needed to come to his own conclusions about his biological father rather than having Jake tell him what to think. Still, Jake stayed close, ready to pull Finn away if Martin's selfishness started doing real emotional damage, ready to punch Martin if protection required it. The actual circumstances of how Finn had ended up in Ooo emerged in painful fragments and incomplete stories. Martin had been involved in various schemes before Finn was born: confidence games, theft, running from debts and enemies. When Finn was an infant, something happened that Martin described vaguely as complications or bad luck, but which sounded more like consequences catching up to someone who'd been running from them for years. During some crisis or escape attempt, baby Finn ended up separated from Martin. The details changed depending on when Martin told the story, suggesting he was either lying or genuinely didn't remember clearly because he hadn't been paying enough attention at the time. What became clear through Martin's deflections and half-truths was that his response to losing his child wasn't to search desperately or mourn intensely. It was to keep running, to keep living his life, to maybe occasionally feel bad about it, but never bad enough to actually change course or go back and look for his son. Finn had been abandoned not through tragic circumstances beyond anyone's control, but through Martin's choice to prioritize his own freedom over his son's welfare. When pressed, Martin's excuse was essentially things happen and it was complicated, never taking real responsibility, never showing genuine remorse for leaving an infant to float across an ocean and hoping that worked out okay. Finn's reaction to these truths went through painful stages. First came denial, the attempt to see Martin as better than he appeared, to find excuses for his father's selfishness. Finn wanted desperately to believe that Martin had reasons, that underneath the surface was a good person forced into bad choices by circumstances. He tried bonding through adventures, thinking maybe if they fought together or solved problems together, Martin would see Finn's worth and want to be part of his life. Jake participated in these attempts while knowing they were doomed, supporting his brother even while internally preparing for the inevitable disappointment. The adventures they went on together, escaping the prison, dealing with Martin's various enemies and debts, only reinforced how fundamentally different Finn and Martin were. When they encountered people in danger, Finn wanted to help and Martin wanted to find the fastest escape route. When they had to choose between doing the right thing and doing the easy thing, Finn consistently chose right, while Martin looked for shortcuts that usually involved lying or abandoning others. Finn kept trying to inspire his father to bring out heroism he was convinced must exist somewhere inside every person, but Martin just wasn't built that way. He wasn't a hero corrupted by circumstance. He was just a guy who'd never valued other people enough to sacrifice for them. The breaking point came during a crisis in space, on some cosmic structure or station where Martin's past had finally caught up with him completely. They were in genuine danger, the kind of threat that required trust and cooperation to survive. Finn was fighting, trying to protect both of them and doubt the innocent people caught in the situation. And Martin, when presented with a chance to escape alone or stay and help his son, chose escape without hesitation. No dramatic speech, no tearful goodbye, no moment of internal conflict. Just Martin taking the first exit available and disappearing back into the cosmos to live his life free from complications like having a son who needed him. Finn was left floating in space, alone, having to be rescued by others because his father had valued his own freedom more than Finn's life. The betrayal was complete and undeniable. No more hoping things would get better, no more trying to build bridges to someone who kept burning them, no more pretending Martin was secretly good underneath the selfishness. Jake found Finn afterwards and didn't say, "I told you so," just held his brother in that weird way stretchy dogs can and let him process the hurt without judgment or pressure to move past it quickly. The aftermath was quiet but deep. Finn didn't talk about Martin much, didn't make grand speeches about his feelings or his pain. He just absorbed the truth that his biological father was a selfish coward, that being someone's child didn't guarantee love or protection, that the family who raised you mattered infinitely more than genetic connection. Joshua and Margaret had been his real parents. They'd chosen him, protected him, taught him how to be good, given him values and love and a sense of purpose. Martin was just biology, just a fact of origin with no emotional weight, except disappointment and the lesson that sometimes people are exactly as selfish as they appear. Jake's response was protective fury mixed with practical support. He'd already had complicated feelings about Martin from the start, seeing through the selfish behavior immediately. Now, with Martin's abandonment complete, Jake made sure Finn understood that family wasn't blood. It was choice and presence and showing up when it mattered. Jake had been there for Finn their entire lives. Lady Rainicorn was family now. Jake's puppies were family. Princess Bubblegum and Marceline and even the weird friends they'd made across dimensions, all of these connections mattered more than one selfish human, who happened to share Finn's DNA. Jake's support wasn't subtle or complex, it was direct and honest, exactly what Finn needed to hear. The experience with Martin changed Finn in subtle but important ways that would affect how he approached everything afterward. He stopped expecting the universe to reward him for being good. He stopped assuming that being brave or heroic would make people love him or stay with him. He learned that some people were just bad at caring about others, and no amount of trying or hoping or being a good son would change that fundamental selfishness. It was a dark lesson, one that sat uncomfortable next to his natural optimism and his desire to see good in everyone. But it made him more realistic, more grounded, more willing to accept that the universe wasn't fair and that heroism didn't guarantee happiness or love or even basic respect from people who should care about you. Princess Bubblegum, when she learned what happened, offered Finn quiet support in her characteristic way, not overly emotional but genuine, letting him know that his worth wasn't determined by Martin's failures. Marceline, who understood what it meant to be abandoned by people who should have cared, shared her own experiences in rare moments of openness, not as advice but as solidarity. The Land of Ooo continued around him, indifferent to family drama the way it was indifferent to most personal pain. Finn kept adventuring, kept helping people, kept being a hero. But he did it now with the understanding that heroism didn't guarantee happiness, that being good didn't mean good things would happen to you, that the universe was neither fair nor invested in your emotional well-being. Martin was out there somewhere, probably running another con, probably not thinking about his son at all. And Finn was here, in the treehouse with Jake, dealing with his feelings the way teenagers deal with feelings, shoving them down most of the time but letting them surface occasionally when the night was quiet and there were no monsters to fight. The Martin arc didn't close with reconciliation or understanding or Martin becoming a better person. It closed with Finn accepting that some people wouldn't change and that the healthiest response was to let them go, to stop waiting for them to become what you needed, to build your life around people who actually showed up. It was a hard lesson, but it was true, and Finn carried that truth forward into every relationship and every adventure that came after. Just when Finn thought he'd reached his limit for existential revelations about himself and his place in the universe, reality decided to inform him that he was cosmically significant in ways he'd never imagined, and honestly, would have preferred not to know. The revelation came through ancient prophecies, cosmic entities like Prismo, and the return of those comets we mentioned back in the beginning. The celestial objects that brought change and transformation to Earth across eons. Finn learned that he wasn't just some random kid who happened to get raised by dogs in a magical land. He was part of a cycle, a reincarnation of something called the Catalyst Comet, a cosmic force that arrived periodically thought to bring fundamental change to the world and everyone in it. The history stretched back through multiple incarnations across inconceivable spans of time. The Catalyst Comet had come during the age of dinosaurs, bringing transformation that ended one era and started another. It had returned during the time of ancient elementals, changing the world again in ways that rippled through history. Its essence had manifested in different forms across different eras, sometimes as pure destruction, sometimes as raw potential, sometimes as conscious beings who didn't know they carried cosmic significance. And Finn was the current incarnation, a human boy carrying the comet's transformative essence without realizing it, living an ordinary adventurer's life while being fundamentally connected to the universe's pattern of change and renewal that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. This information arrived just as another comet approached Earth, right on schedule according to cosmic cycles that nobody consulted or could prevent. But this comet wasn't empty or mindless. It's like a ball of ice and rock. Something was coming with it, something that recognized what Finn was and wanted to use that cosmic connection for its own purposes. Orgolorg, that ancient evil we mentioned living disguised as a harmless penguin in the Ice Kingdom, sensed the comet's approach and remembered what he'd been before being diminished and exiled to Earth. He'd been a conqueror once, millennia ago, a being of immense power who'd tried to absorb a comet's energy and use it to remake reality according to his will. Orgolorg's first attempt at cosmic power had failed catastrophically. Other cosmic forces had struck him down, punishing his ambition by shrinking him into a tiny, helpless form and stripping away most of his memories and consciousness. The being that crash-landed on Earth and eventually became one of the Ice King's pet penguins had no awareness of what it had been, just instinctive behaviors and occasional flashes of something vast and terrifying buried beneath the cute waddling exterior. For eons, Orgolorg existed as Gunter, eating fish and saying wink, and being the Ice King's favorite companion, completely harmless and completely unaware of the universe conquering. Entity was sleeping inside that small penguin body. But now, with the Catalyst Comet approaching and its energy washing across Earth in invisible waves, Orgolorg began to wake up. The memories returned in fragments, images of cosmic conquest, of absorbing stellar energies, of power that could reshape galaxies. The cute penguin facade started cracking, literally, as something massive and tentacled and eldritch pushed against the diminished form from inside. The Ice King, completely unaware that one of his penguins was actually an ancient cosmic evil, began noticing that Gunter was acting strange, staring at the sky, moving with purpose rather than random waddling, occasionally emitting sounds that were definitely not wank, but rather deep reverberating tones that hurt to hear. The Ice King's connection to Orgolorg, years of keeping Gunter as a pet, of talking to him and feeding him and treating him like a beloved companion, became a vulnerability that the waking entity could exploit. The Ice King trusted Gunter completely, never suspecting that the penguin he loved was a parasite waiting to use him as a stepping stone toward cosmic power. When Orgolorg's true form finally began surfacing, breaking through the cute exterior like a nightmare hatching from an egg, the Ice King's reaction was heartbreak wrapped in confusion. Even his favorite penguin, the one creature he thought genuinely cared about him, was actually something else entirely, something that had been using him all along. It was another loss in the Ice King's long list of losses, another betrayal by someone he'd trusted, another proof that his loneliness was maybe justified because everyone who got close to him eventually hurt him. Finn had to face an impossible choice during this crisis. The Catalyst Comet approaching Earth represented change on a fundamental level, and Finn, as the comet's current incarnation, could choose to leave with it, to return to his cosmic form, to rejoin the cycle of universal transformation. It wasn't presented as punishment or reward, not as death or ascension, just as an option, the natural next step in a cycle that had been repeating since before humanity existed. Finn could continue his role as an agent of cosmic change, moving through the universe bringing transformation to different worlds and realities, or he could choose to stay in the form he'd grown up with, remain the person he'd become, keep living the life he'd built with Jake and his friends in the Land of Ooo. The comet itself appeared in the sky, visible and growing, beautiful in a way that made people stop and stare. It wasn't threatening in appearance, just radiant, purple and blue energies swirling in patterns that felt significant without being interpretable. But the pressure it exerted on reality was immense. Things began changing in subtle ways as it approached. Colors looked different, time felt elastic, people experienced strange emotions they couldn't explain, and Finn felt pulled toward it, not physically but essentially, like the comet was calling to part of him that existed deeper than personality or memory, calling to the cosmic purpose he'd been carrying unknowingly his entire life. Jake's role during this crisis was desperately trying to reach Finn, to remind him of who he was, to anchor his brother to their shared life before cosmic forces pulled him away permanently. Jake didn't fully understand the metaphysics or the cosmic cycles or what it meant to be a reincarnated catalyst of change. He just knew that Finn was in danger of disappearing into something that wasn't human anymore, wasn't his brother in any way that mattered. Jake shouted and stretched and fought through obstacles to get to Finn, carrying the simple message that family and friendship and the connections you've built matter more than destiny or cosmic roles or the universe's grand plans for your soul. Orgolorg, meanwhile, was racing toward the comet with single-minded determination. His true form had fully emerged now, a massive tentacled horror that looked like something from the darkest corners of cosmic space, all eyes and mouths and geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional reality. The cute penguin Gunter was gone completely, dissolved into this vastness, revealed as nothing more than a chrysalis for something ancient and ambitious and utterly without mercy. Orgolorg flew toward the approaching comet, intent on absorbing its power, on using the catalyst energy to become what he'd been before his first defeat, to remake himself as a cosmic conqueror who could challenge the fundamental forces of reality itself. The final confrontation happened in the space between Earth and the comet, in an area where physics behaved strangely and the rules of normal existence bent around cosmic forces. Finn, Jake, Orgolorg, and the comet itself existed in this liminal zone where choices would determine not just individual fates, but potentially the fate of Earth and possibly multiple realities. Orgolorg reached the comet first, attempting to merge with it, to absorb its transformative power into his own being. For terrible moments, it looked like he might succeed, like the ancient evil would reclaim cosmic power and become an immediate threat to everything that existed. But Finn made his choice in that crucial moment. He rejected the comet's call, not dramatically but quietly, simply deciding that he wanted to remain Finn rather than become something cosmic and impersonal. The comet accepted this without judgment, its purpose not to force transformation, but to offer it. And in that acceptance, in Finn's rejection of his cosmic role, something shifted. The comet's power, instead of flowing into Orgolorg or pulling Finn away from his life, simply moved on, continued its journey through space toward other worlds and other eras where its transformative energy would find willing vessels. Orgolorg, denied the power he had been reaching for, was caught in the comet's wake and pulled along with it, dragged away from Earth and thrown back into the cosmic void he'd been trying to escape for millennia. The Ice King watched Orgolorg disappear into space, confused and sad about losing Gunter, not fully comprehending what had happened, but understanding that his favorite penguin was gone and wasn't coming back. Just another thing taken from him without explanation, another relationship that turned out to be based on lies or misunderstanding, another reminder that his life was mostly loss interrupted by brief moments of confused connection. Someone tried to explain to him that Gunter had been an ancient evil, that the penguin he'd loved never really existed, but the Ice King didn't fully process it. He just knew Gunter was gone, and that hurt in ways he couldn't articulate. Finn returned to Earth having made the most mature decision of his life. Not the heroic choice or the destined choice, just the choice to be himself instead of what the universe suggested he could become. It was choosing his messy, complicated teenage life over cosmic transcendence, choosing Jake and Princess Bubblegum and Marceline and Treehouse Breakfast over infinite transformation and universal purpose. The comet didn't argue or try to convince him otherwise. It just accepted his choice and departed, continuing its cycle elsewhere in the infinite cosmos, leaving Finn as fully human and fully himself as he'd always been, but now aware of what he'd chosen and what he'd given up. The aftermath left Finn with uncomfortable knowledge about himself that he couldn't unlearn. He was cosmically significant, tied to forces that operated on scales beyond kingdoms and adventures and individual lives. His existence wasn't random, it was part of a pattern, a cycle of change that had been repeating since before humans existed, since before the Earth had its current form. But Finn refused to let that knowledge define him or change how he lived. He was still a hero because he chose to be, still Finn because he insisted on it, still committed to helping people in the Land of Ooo because that's what felt right, not because destiny demanded it or cosmic forces required it. Jake was profoundly relieved to have his brother back, to know that Finn had chosen their life together over whatever cosmic alternative had been offered. They talked about it afterwards, not in deep philosophical terms, but in the simple language of brothers who'd almost lost each other and didn't want to focus too much on how close that loss had come. Jake's perspective remained grounded. They lived in the timeline they lived in, were the people they were, and thinking too hard about cosmic significance was a waste of time that could be better spent playing video games or eating sandwiches. Finn mostly agreed, though the knowledge sat in the back of his mind, a reminder that the universe was bigger and stranger than everyday adventures suggested. The cosmic roll was just background noise now, something Finn acknowledged but didn't let control his decisions. He'd chosen his life over the universe's plans, and that choice made everything he did afterward feel more intentional, more truly his. He wasn't a hero because of destiny or reincarnation or cosmic cycles. He was a hero because he kept choosing to be one every day in small decisions and large battles. That felt more meaningful somehow, more real than being important because some ancient comet had decided to incarnate as a teenage boy in a magical land. Finn was just Finn, and for the first time in a while, that felt like enough. While Finn was dealing with cosmic revelations and absent fathers, the Land of Ooo finally began confronting the tragedy it had been treating as comedy for decades. The Ice King had always been there, annoying, pathetic, kidnapping princesses and causing trouble in ways that felt more sad than dangerous. But nobody had really looked at the truth underneath the blue skin and the delusional schemes. Nobody asked why a powerful wizard spent his time on these desperate attempts at romance, why he seemed confused about reality in ways that went beyond simple eccentricity, why moments of genuine clarity occasionally broke through the madness before being swallowed again by whatever was wrong with him. Then people started finding pieces of his past preserved in old recordings and artifacts, and suddenly the jokes stopped being funny at all. Marceline carried the heaviest weight of this knowledge because she'd known Simon before, had watched his transformation firsthand as a child during the worst years of the Mushroom War's aftermath. For centuries, she'd dealt with the Ice King as this separate entity, this annoying old man who occasionally showed up and caused problems, carefully keeping the truth at a distance because acknowledging it hurt too much. She'd built walls around the memories of Simon, protected herself from the pain of recognizing that the kind man who'd saved her life was still trapped inside the magical curse that had consumed him. But moments kept surfacing where the Ice King would do something, play music a certain way, say something in a particular tone, show a flash of genuine kindness under the delusions that reminded Marceline of Simon, and each reminder was a wound, reopening, proof that the person she'd loved as a father figure was still in there somewhere, still suffering without understanding why, unable to escape or even fully comprehend what had happened to him. The episode that truly broke the surface came when old videotapes surfaced from before the Mushroom War, found in ruins or recovered from ancient storage facilities. These were recordings Simon Petrikov had made, documenting what the crown was doing to him before he'd lost the ability to understand his own transformation. The tapes showed Simon as he'd been, a human man with glasses and gentle eyes, wearing normal clothes, speaking in academic tones about the artifact he'd discovered, but as the recordings progressed chronologically, you could see him changing. His eyes became more confused. His explanations became more scattered. He started forgetting things mid-sentence, losing track of what he'd been trying to document. In one tape that Marceline found particularly unbearable to watch, Simon sang a song, a simple, heartbreaking melody about memory and loss, about watching yourself disappear and being unable to stop it. The lyrics revealed the awful truth of his existence in plain language. He was still in there, trapped inside the Ice King, watching himself become a monster, unable to stop the transformation or escape the crown's influence. The Ice King didn't remember making these tapes, didn't remember being Simon at all, except in rare flickering moments that terrified him before being swallowed by the crown's madness. It was torture on an extended timeline, measured in centuries rather than moments, a good man being slowly destroyed by his own survival mechanism with no hope of rescue or relief. Another tape showed Simon recording a message specifically for Betty, his partner who disappeared into dimensional chaos trying to save him. He spoke directly to the camera as if she might someday find this recording and understand what had happened. He apologized for wearing the crown, for not being strong enough to resist its power, for becoming something she wouldn't recognize. He talked about how each use took more of him away, how he could feel his personality fragmenting with every deployment of ice magic, how he was terrified of forgetting her completely, but knew it was inevitable. By the end of the recording, Simon was crying, and Marceline, watching centuries later, found herself crying too, confronting the full weight of what she'd been avoiding for so long. The revelation changed how people across Ooo interacted with the Ice King, though not always in ways he understood or could appreciate. Princess Bubblegum, who'd always treated his kidnappings as tedious but manageable problems requiring standard security responses, started looking at him with something closer to pity mixed with scientific frustration. She began researching the crown in earnest, trying to understand its magic from a technical perspective, looking for ways to reverse its effects, or at least mitigate the suffering it caused. Her laboratory filled with notes about curse theory and magical neurology, subjects she had previously considered less important than candy person genetics or kingdom defense systems. Finn and Jake, who'd fought the Ice King dozens of times and laughed at his failures and ridiculous schemes, found the jokes catching in their throats now. Every kidnapping attempt became uncomfortable to witness, not because it was dangerous, but because they knew this wasn't really the Ice King choosing to do these things. It was the crown's madness expressing itself through a man who'd once been kind and rational, forcing him to act out fantasies about princesses and marriage that he wouldn't have had if his mind was his own. Finn started pulling his punches during fights, trying to stop the Ice King without actually hurting him, treating him more like someone who needed help than someone who needed defeating. Even the other kingdoms, which had written the Ice King off as a nuisance villain barely worth taking seriously, had to reconsider their dismissive attitudes. The truth about Simon spread through political channels and casual gossip in equal measure. People began understanding that the Ice King was both perpetrator and victim. Yes, he kidnapped princesses and caused problems, but he did so because an ancient cursed artifact had destroyed his mind and left him in a state of confused suffering that he wasn't even aware of most of the time. The ethical implications were complicated. Should they keep fighting him? Try to contain him? Attempt to help him even though helping seemed impossible? There were no good answers, just uncomfortable compromises. Marceline tried reaching Simon multiple times after these revelations, attempting to break through the crown's influence and connect with the man she'd known during those desperate post-war years. Sometimes it worked for brief, precious moments. Simon would surface, recognize her, say something that proved he remembered their time together in the wasteland, remember Hambo or the songs he'd sung, or the way he'd kept her safe when the world was ending. But these moments of clarity never lasted more than minutes before the crown reasserted control, pushing Simon back down into the depths of the Ice King's consciousness, leaving only confusion and questions about why Marceline was crying or angry or desperately trying to reach someone who the Ice King didn't remember being. These failed attempts at connection were almost worse than not trying at all, because they proved Simon was still there, still suffering, still unable to escape his magical prison even for extended periods. Marceline would walk away from these encounters feeling like she'd lost Simon again, experiencing the grief of his disappearance on repeat every time she managed to reach him only to watch him slip away. Princess Bubblegum tried to help, offering scientific analysis and experimental approaches to breaking the crown's hold, but nothing worked for more than moments. The curse was too deep, too fundamental to the Ice King's survival after centuries of dependence. The Ice King himself remained mostly unaware of these revelations and the changed attitudes they created, living in his delusions because the crown wouldn't let him access the truth about himself. He continued kidnapping princesses, continued building ice sculptures and hosting imaginary parties, continued being lonely in ways he couldn't fully articulate or understand. The tragedy was that making him permanently aware of his condition would be cruel. Simon's consciousness recognizing what he'd become, understanding that he had been trapped in magical madness for centuries, was too painful to inflict deliberately. The few times Simon surfaced and understood his situation, the horror and despair were absolute, so the Ice King existed in merciful ignorance most of the time, only occasionally surfacing into Simon awareness long enough to feel the full weight of his curse before the crown pulled him back under into protective delusion. The tapes became artifacts that people handled carefully, aware they were documenting one of the Land of Oo's saddest, ongoing tragedies. Marceline kept copies, even though watching them hurt, because they were proof that Simon had existed, that the man she'd loved as a child guardian had been real and kind before the crown destroyed him. She sometimes played them when she needed to remember why she kept trying to reach him, why she couldn't just write the Ice King off as a lost cause the way most people did. The music he'd sung echoed through her own songs, his influence present in her art, even though he'd been gone as himself for longer than most civilizations existed. This era established firmly that some problems couldn't be solved with heroism or fighting or even good intentions backed by significant resources. The Ice King couldn't be saved by punching him or reasoning with him or finding the right magic words or developing the perfect spell. The crown's curse was too deep, too fundamental to his survival after centuries of magical dependence. Removing the crown would kill him. His body had been sustained by its magic for so long that it had become physiologically dependent on the power in ways that couldn't be reversed without fatal consequences. Saving Simon meant either killing the Ice King or finding magic powerful enough to undo centuries of transformation while somehow keeping his body alive through a process that would normally destroy it. And neither option seemed possible given the tools and knowledge available. The emotional weight of this knowledge sat differently on everyone who carried it. Marceline bore it as grief for someone who was dead, but still walking around wearing a corpse made of ice and madness. Someone she could see and talk to, but never truly reach. Bubblegum carried it as a scientific problem she couldn't solve, a reminder that her intelligence and resources had limits, that some curses were stronger than her ability to break them. Finn carried it as proof that heroism sometimes meant just bearing witness to suffering you couldn't fix, standing beside people in their pain even when you couldn't make it stop. And the Ice King carried it unconsciously as a weight that made his loneliness deeper and his delusions more necessary, never quite understanding why everyone looked at him with such complicated expressions now when he showed up to kidnap another princess or invite them to imaginary parties in his ice fortress. The Land of Ooo continued forward with this knowledge, carrying the tragedy alongside everything else. The adventures and battles, the kingdom politics, and random monster attacks, all happening while one of the most powerful beings in the land suffered continuously from a curse nobody could break. It became part of the landscape, another sad truth in a world built on apocalypse and magic, another reminder that the Land of Oo's cheerful weirdness often masked deep pain. And somewhere in the Ice Kingdom, the Ice King played his drums and kidnapped his princesses and lived his confused half-life, never knowing that people had finally understood his tragedy, never aware that he'd become a symbol of suffering that couldn't be fixed no matter how much people cared, or tried, or wished things could be different. Marceline's past came calling in the form of 8 ancient vampires, creatures she'd hunted and killed centuries ago when the world was still recovering from the Mushroom War, and survival meant becoming more dangerous than the things trying to kill you. These weren't sparkly romantic vampires or tragic misunderstood monsters from stories. They were the real thing, powerful and hungry and representing the darkest stretch of Marceline's long life. She'd killed them all eventually, one by one across decades of hunting, absorbed their essence and powers to survive in a world that demanded you become a predator or become prey. In doing so, she'd become the vampire queen not through choice or desire, but through sheer necessity, taking on powers she didn't want because the alternative was death. Now, through a series of events involving attempts to cure Marceline's vampirism and return her to full mortality, these ancient threats were rising again. The magic that bound them to death had been connected to Marceline's vampire essence, and when that essence was removed from her, it released them like prisoners escaping when their chains dissolved. One by one, they returned. The Fool, chaotic and unpredictable. The Empress, regal and cruel. The Hierophant, ancient and magically powerful. And others, each representing different aspects of vampiric power, each carrying grudges and hungers that hadn't diminished during their centuries of imprisonment in Marceline's soul. The decision to cure Marceline's vampirism came from a place of exhaustion and longing that had been building for centuries. She'd been a vampire for longer than most civilizations existed, immortal and powerful, but also fundamentally separate from the life cycles everyone else experienced. Watching people die while she continued, being unable to feel warmth or sunlight, unable to eat normal food or connect with mortals in certain ways because of her undead nature, it wore on her in ways she rarely admitted even to herself. The isolation of immortality wasn't just about outliving people. It was about existing in a different category of being, always set apart, always watching life happen to others while remaining outside it. When Princess Bubblegum presented the possibility of becoming mortal again through careful application of scientific magic and medical procedure, Marceline took it despite the risks and despite knowing it would leave her vulnerable. She wanted to be human again, or half-demon at least. To experience time and mortality like everyone else did. She wanted the possibility of ending eventually, of not having to watch everyone she cared about disappear into death while she remained unchanged. She wanted to feel the sun again without it burning her, to eat regular food, to exist as something more alive than undead. The desire was deep and genuine, born from centuries of accumulated loneliness and the exhausting weight of outliving everything that mattered. The cure worked, initially draining the vampire essence from Marceline through a process that looked like science but functioned like magic, pulling the undead power out of her cellular structure and leaving her mortal, vulnerable, and suddenly aware of how fragile normal existence felt. Her skin became warmer, less pale. Her need for red became a preference rather than a compulsion. The sun felt different, not burning, but just bright and present. She could taste food again, feel tiredness in her muscles, notice her heartbeat as something real rather than an echo of life maintained by vampiric power. For brief hours, Marceline experienced what it meant to be truly alive again, and it felt like relief mixed with terror. But the removed vampire essence couldn't just dissipate into nothing. Magic and power don't work that way. It needed somewhere to go, some container or form or destination. And in the magical mechanics of the universe, removing Marceline's vampire power meant releasing the souls or essences of the vampires she'd killed to acquire that power. They'd been trapped inside her all along, their consciousness and abilities absorbed and contained, waiting for any weakness in her hold over them. Now, with the vampire power extracted and looking for new hosts, they returned to independent existence, manifesting across the Land of Ooo one by one, confused and angry and hungry after centuries of imprisonment. Princess Bubblegum took charge of the crisis immediately, not just as a ruler protecting her kingdom, but as someone personally invested in Marceline's safety and well-being. She organized defenses, mobilized the banana guards into actually useful formations, created weapons and strategies specifically designed to fight vampires using a combination of scientific analysis and adapted magical theory. Stakes made from specially grown wood, barriers of garlic and holy symbols adapted from old-world religious texts, sunlight concentration devices that could project focused beams. Bubblegum approached vampire hunting like an engineering problem, breaking down their strengths and weaknesses into manageable data points. And she stayed close to Marceline throughout everything, closer than she'd let herself be in decades or centuries, the crisis burning away the careful distance they'd maintained in their complicated relationship. Bubblegum set up a protected area where Marceline could stay safe while mortal and vulnerable, somewhere defensible that the vampires couldn't easily penetrate. She checked on Marceline constantly, more worried than she wanted to admit about what would happen if these ancient predators reached her while she was weak. The protection was born from genuine care that had been buried under centuries of complicated history and mutual hurt, and Marceline responded to that care in ways she hadn't allowed herself to respond before, accepting help instead of pushing it away. The fights themselves ranged across different environments and required different strategies as each vampire emerged with their own particular powers and personalities. The Fool appeared first in the Candy Kingdom outskirts, moving with chaotic unpredictability, attacking randomly and retreating just as randomly, impossible to anticipate because his actions followed no logical pattern. He wasn't the strongest vampire, but he was the hardest to pin down, fighting with random violence that was hard to defend against. Finn and Jake joined that battle, trying to protect Candy's citizens while Bubblegum's guards worked to corner the Fool long enough to stake him properly. The Empress arrived with more fanfare and ego, manifesting in a ruined castle that she'd apparently ruled from centuries ago before Marceline killed her. She was regal and cruel in equal measure, wielding vampire powers like royal authority, treating everyone as subjects to be controlled or destroyed based on her whims. Her abilities included mind control and the power to create lesser vampires from victims, turning citizens into thralls who fought for her. The battle against her required freeing her victims first, breaking her mental hold on them before they could focus on the Empress herself. Marceline, even while mortal, helped with this fight by playing music that disrupted the Empress's control, using her bass and her voice to create sounds that broke through magical influence. The Hierophant was worse, ancient beyond even the others, carrying knowledge and magical abilities that went beyond simple vampiric powers. He'd been a scholar before becoming a vampire, someone who'd studied the dark arts and incorporated them into his undead nature, creating a hybrid of vampirism and sorcery that made him genuinely terrifying. His battle took place in a library or ancient structure where he could use runic magic and summoned creatures alongside his vampire abilities. Bubblegum had to counter his spells with scientific principles, creating technological solutions to magical problems, improvising weapons that disrupted his sorcery while Finn kept him physically occupied. Each vampire Marceline had killed represented a chapter in her past, a battle she'd already fought once during the worst parts of her long life and thought she'd finished. Now she had to face them again, but mortal this time, without the vampire powers that had let her win before. She couldn't go into direct combat. She'd be killed easily in her current state, but she could provide information about their weaknesses, their fighting styles, their histories. She told Finn and Bubblegum and Jake about where she'd first encountered each vampire, what tactics had worked before, what powers they possessed, and she had to confront what she'd done to survive, what she'd become to live through the worst parts of history when being good meant being dead. The moon appeared as one of the vampires, a creature who could block out the sun and create eternal night across regions, making the entire Land of Ooo vulnerable to vampire dominion. When the moon vampire manifested and began his power, darkness fell across Ooo in the middle of the day, confusing citizens and creating panic. Plants stopped producing energy, temperature dropped, and vampires suddenly had no weakness to work around. They could hunt freely in the artificial night. This vampire required a different strategy entirely, one that involved reaching him at high altitude where he maintained his power and disrupting his control over the celestial darkness. The battle was aerial and desperate, fought in thin air where breathing was hard and falling meant death. As each vampire was defeated and staked properly, Marceline felt the essence of their power flowing back into her, unavoidable and automatic. The vampire abilities she'd briefly escaped were returning whether she wanted them or not, pulled back into her by the magical mechanics of how she'd acquired them in the first place. With each returned power, she became less mortal and more vampire again, feeling the familiar cold settle back into her bones, watching her skin pale, noticing the sun beginning to burn again. The return to vampirism wasn't smooth or pleasant. It felt like losing something precious she'd just briefly reclaimed, like watching mortality slip away again after touching it for only moments. The final confrontation came with the Vampire King himself, the original source of vampiric power in the Land of Ooo, the first and most dangerous of all the vampires Marceline had fought centuries ago. He'd been sealed away the longest, had the most reason to be angry about his imprisonment, carried power that made all the others look weak by comparison. When he manifested, the air itself felt heavier, darker, corrupted by his presence. He was ancient in ways that predated the Mushroom War, possibly predated human civilization entirely, a being who'd been feeding on intelligent life since the world was young, and would continue feeding until nothing with blood remained. The Vampire King's arrival in the Candy Kingdom was apocalyptic in scope. He moved through the streets, draining color from everything, turning the bright pink buildings gray and lifeless, creating zones of death wherever he walked. His powers included all the abilities the other vampires had possessed, plus unique capabilities. He could drain life from a distance, could turn crowds into vampires with a glance, could make the sun itself dim in his presence. Bubblegum's defenses crumbled before him. Regular stakes and holy symbols barely slowed him down. It became clear quickly that conventional vampire hunting tactics wouldn't work against something this fundamentally powerful. Marceline had to choose in that moment whether to reclaim her full vampire powers to fight him or die as a mortal trying to stop an immortal predator. The choice came down to identity and acceptance. Did she want to be powerful and immortal, but separated from normal life, or vulnerable and temporary, but genuinely alive in the ways that mattered to her? The Vampire King didn't wait for her decision, advancing on the Candy Kingdom's heart, preparing to turn Princess Bubblegum herself into a vampire and use her as a symbolic victory over everything mortals had built in this post-apocalyptic world. Marceline chose to take the powers back, but with a crucial difference from before. She didn't do it out of fear or survival instinct or because circumstances forced her. She did it as a conscious choice, accepting what she was rather than trying to reject or escape it. She walked directly toward the Vampire King, let the final vampire essence flow back into her, felt all her accumulated powers return and settle into place. The transformation was complete and instant. She became the Vampire Queen again, but this time carrying the title differently, wearing it with understanding rather than resentment. She wasn't a vampire because circumstance forced it on her anymore. She was a vampire because she chose to be, accepted the responsibility and isolation that came with it, and made peace with the idea that she would keep living through eras and watching people leave while she remained. The battle between Marceline and the Vampire King was personal and vicious, fought across the Candy Kingdom and up into the air, two ancient vampires pushing their powers to absolute limits. The Vampire King had more raw power and more centuries of experience, but Marceline had something he didn't, people fighting alongside her, connections that gave her strength beyond just personal power. Bubblegum provided support with technology and strategy. Finn and Jake fought at ground level, keeping lesser threats away, and Marceline fought not just to survive but to protect the people she cared about, fighting for connection rather than just victory. When the Vampire King was finally defeated, staked and destroyed through combined effort, and Marceline's full vampire power turned against him, his essence tried to flow into Marceline like the others had, but she refused it, rejected his power specifically, found a way to contain his malevolent force separately rather than absorbing it into herself. The other vampire powers she'd accepted back, made peace with as part of who she was. But the Vampire King's essence was too corrupted, too fundamentally evil to integrate. She sealed it away, hopefully for good this time, preventing his eventual return while keeping her own vampire nature intact but under her control. The aftermath was quiet resolution mixed with acceptance. The vampires were gone again, their essences contained within Marceline but under her conscious control now rather than as prisoners she'd been unaware of. The Candy Kingdom recovered from the attacks, repairing buildings and treating citizens who'd been turned into temporary vampires. And Marceline's relationship with Princess Bubblegum shifted into something more honest and stable than it had been in centuries. They'd fought side by side, trusted each other completely in ways they hadn't managed before despite their long history. Bubblegum had seen Marceline's full past, every dark thing she'd done to survive, every vampire she'd killed and absorbed, and had stayed anyway, fought beside her anyway, cared about her anyway. Marceline talked to Bubblegum afterwards about what it meant to be immortal again, to have chosen vampire existence over mortality. She admitted she'd wanted to be mortal, wanted to experience ending eventually, wanted to stop watching everyone die. But she also admitted that being a vampire was part of who she was, that she'd spent more of her existence undead than alive, that rejecting her vampire nature completely meant rejecting centuries of history and survival. Bubblegum listened without judgment, understanding that immortality wasn't the gift mortals sometimes imagined it to be, that living forever meant carrying accumulated pain and roar and loss that never got resolved through natural ending. Their relationship wasn't perfect after stakes. They still had different personalities, different approaches to problems, centuries of complicated history that couldn't be erased by one crisis. But it was real now, built on complete honesty rather than careful distance. They'd seen each other at their most vulnerable and most powerful, had fought together against genuine threats, had made choices to protect each other that revealed what they actually meant to one another. The relationship moved forward more openly after this, less hidden, more willing to be acknowledged as genuine partnership rather than just complicated history between immortal beings. Marceline walked away from stakes carrying her immortality more lightly than before, no longer seeing it as a curse she needed to escape but as simply what she was. She'd faced her past, literally fought the vampires who'd shaped her into what she'd become, and come out the other side, still herself but more integrated, more at peace with the contradictions of her nature. The loneliness wouldn't go away completely. Immortality still meant watching mortals age and die, still meant existing slightly outside normal life cycles. But she had people now who knew her fully, who understood what she'd survived and what she'd done to survive it, who didn't flinch from the darkness in her past or the power in her present. That was something. In a life measured in centuries, finding even one person who actually understood you was maybe worth all the years of isolation, and Marceline had found that in Bubblegum, despite how long it had taken them to get there. Finn's human heritage had always been background mystery, a question everyone accepted, but nobody pursued seriously because pursuing it seemed impossible. Humans were extinct in Ooo, or so everyone thought. Just Finn and maybe Susan Strong, and a handful of others scattered so rare that finding them felt like discovering living fossils. Then evidence emerged through ancient records and recovered data that humans hadn't completely vanished from Earth. They'd just left Ooo behind, migrating somewhere far across the ocean, creating a separate society while the magical land developed without them. When Finn learned about the islands, about a human civilization that survived the Mushroom War through complete isolation, he knew immediately that he had to go there, had to see what humans became when they weren't raised by dogs in magical kingdoms, had to find answers about where he'd really come from. Jake agreed to come along despite his reservations, because leaving Finn to journey alone wasn't an option, even when the destination was across an ocean neither of them had ever crossed. Susan Strong joined them, another human with fragmented memories and questions about her own origins. BMO came because BMO went on adventures with Finn and Jake. That's what they did together. They gathered supplies, borrowed a boat that looked seaworthy, and set sail toward coordinates recovered from old databases and ancient maps that may or may not have been accurate after centuries of geographical changes and rising sea levels. The journey itself was long and contemplative, giving Finn days and weeks to build expectations about what he'd find. He imagined humans living freely, maybe primitively, but happily, building something genuine in the aftermath of apocalypse without magic to complicate survival. He expected to feel instant connection, to finally be among his people and understand himself better, to find the missing piece of his identity that would explain why he'd always felt slightly different in Ooo despite being loved and accepted. The ocean stretched endlessly around them, sometimes calm and sometimes violent, filled with strange creatures and mysterious phenomena that suggested magic wasn't confined to land. Jake worried quietly during the calm moments, recognizing the hope building in Finn's eyes, and knowing from experience that hope built that high usually ended in disappointment or complicated truths that were harder than simple answers. When they finally spotted land after weeks of sailing, the first indication that something was different came from the technology. The islands weren't primitive settlements or simple farming communities. They were technologically advanced in ways that felt alien compared to Oo's magical chaos. Tall structures that looked like apartments or offices, working electricity visible from a distance, organized streets and infrastructure that suggested planning and systems rather than organic growth. As they got closer, more details emerged. Surveillance cameras tracking their approach, defensive systems activating automated responses to unauthorized vessels. This wasn't a society that welcomed visitors or encouraged exploration. This was controlled isolation, safety. Through rigid boundaries and monitored compliance. The islands themselves, when Finn and his friends finally landed and entered the human civilization, were simultaneously impressive and deeply uncomfortable. Humans had survived here not by adapting to the new weird world, but by rejecting it completely, creating a closed society where safety meant isolation and control meant security. Every citizen was monitored constantly through technology that tracked movements and behaviors. Lives were directed by systems designed to prevent chaos, danger, or deviation from carefully planned norms. It was order taken to its extreme. No freedom, but also no uncertainty. No adventure, but also no risk. No individual choice, but also no chance of making dangerous mistakes. The society functioned smoothly and efficiently, but it felt hollow somehow, like watching people live inside a very comfortable prison that they'd been convinced was paradise. Finn discovered his own origin story in fragments and official records that the island's systems provided once they identified him as a former resident. His mother, Minerva, had been a respected doctor and community helper on the islands, someone who genuinely cared about people but lived completely within the system's constraints and believed in its protective philosophy. When Finn was an infant, Martin, his terrible, selfish father, had been fleeing some crisis or crime involving debts or betrayed partners or one of the many consequences of his con artist lifestyle. In the chaos of Martin's escape, baby Finn had ended up on a makeshift raft drifting away from the islands, and Martin's selfish choices and cowardice had prevented any real rescue attempt. He'd prioritized his own escape over recovering his infant son, choosing freedom from consequences over parental responsibility. Minerva, desperate and heartbroken, had tried everything within the island's rules to find her missing son. She'd searched the perimeter, filed requests, begged the authorities to break protocol and send rescue vessels beyond the safety boundaries. But the island's isolation policies were absolute. Leaving meant potentially exposing the population to outside dangers, magical contamination, or the chaotic elements that had destroyed the old world. The system didn't bend for individual tragedies, even when that tragedy was a mother losing her child. So Finn had drifted across the ocean and eventually washed up in Ooo thousands of miles away, where Joshua and Margaret found him and gave him the life he'd actually lived, the family he'd actually known, the identity as a hero he'd built, without any knowledge of where he'd come from. Meeting Minerva was emotionally complicated in ways Finn hadn't anticipated. She'd spent years, decades now, grieving her lost son while continuing to serve the community as best she could. Eventually, when her physical body aged out and medical technology offered an alternative, she'd uploaded her consciousness into a digital system that served the island's population. Now, as Minerva existed as a helper AI spread across the infrastructure, still trying to protect and serve people, but doing it from inside machines and networks rather than flesh and bone. She was technically immortal now in digital form, her personality and memories preserved in code, her medical knowledge and caring nature still active but filtered through computer systems. When Finn finally communicated with digital Minerva and she realized he was her son grown now, 15 or 16 years old, alive and healthy despite everything, her response was overwhelming joy mixed with immediate concern. She was genuinely happy he'd survived, grateful he'd been found and raised by good people, amazed he'd grown into someone brave and kind. But she also immediately started trying to convince him to stay on the islands, to accept the safety and security human civilization offered, to abandon the dangerous magical land he'd grown up in. From Minerva's perspective, shaped by the island's philosophy, Ooo was a death trap where monsters and chaos threatened constantly. She wanted to protect her son, wanted him safe in the way the islands defined safety, couldn't fully understand why he'd choose the dangerous chaos of adventure over the protected order of human civilization. Finn wanted to feel connected to Minerva, wanted this to be the family reunion that Martin had failed to provide. But Minerva existed as data now, her love genuine but filtered through systems and protocols and the island's controlling philosophy. She wanted him to stay, not just because she'd missed him, but because the island's worldview said safety was paramount and freedom was dangerous. Every conversation pulled in two directions, Minerva trying to convince Finn that staying was best, Finn trying to explain that danger and adventure and risk were part of what made life worth living. Neither could fully understand the other's perspective because they'd been shaped by fundamentally different worlds. The islands themselves presented moral questions without easy answers that challenged everything Finn believed about heroism and freedom. The society was controlling and limited, denying people real freedom and genuine risk. Citizens couldn't leave even if they wanted to, couldn't make choices that deviated from approved paths, couldn't experience danger or uncertainty because the systems prevented it. But the society was also genuinely safe. Humans here didn't face monsters or magic or the constant low-level danger that defined life in Ooo. Children grew up without seeing death, without knowing real fear, without understanding that the world could be actively hostile to their existence. Was that wrong? Was it better to be free and endangered, or controlled and protected? Finn, who'd grown up fighting monsters and loving every minute of it, thought the answer was obvious. But meeting people who'd lived their entire lives in safety, who couldn't imagine wanting danger or valuing freedom over security, complicated his certainty significantly. Jake explored the islands with growing discomfort, seeing how regimented and controlled everything was. There were rules for how to walk, where to stand, what to say in different situations. Cameras watched everything. Systems tracked every movement and logged every deviation from normal patterns. It was the opposite of how Jake lived his life. He valued freedom, relaxation, and going with the flow and adapting to situations as they arose. The island's philosophy was the opposite. Prevent situations from arising, control variables before they became problems, eliminate chaos through planning and restriction. Jake hated it instinctively, felt claustrophobic despite the open spaces, wanted to leave almost immediately, but stayed. Because Finn needed support while processing his origins. The crisis on the islands came from an external threat mixing with internal instability in ways that tested everyone's assumptions. Something from outside the protective barriers, maybe a virus, maybe corrupted data, maybe magical contamination that had finally reached across the ocean, began affecting the systems that kept human civilization isolated and controlled. Citizens started questioning the restrictions, wondering if safety was worth the cost of never being allowed to choose their own paths, asking whether the authorities actually had their best interests in mind, or were simply maintaining control for its own sake. Some humans wanted to leave, wanted to see Ooo and experience the weird magical world their ancestors had fled generations ago. Others wanted to stay, wanted to keep the protective systems running even if it meant remaining isolated forever, believed the outside world was too dangerous to risk exposure. Finn and his friends helped resolve the immediate dangers, fighting whatever external threat had breached the barriers, stabilizing the systems that kept the islands functional, protecting citizens who were caught in the chaos between old ways and potential new directions. But they couldn't fix the fundamental tension between freedom and security that the islands represented. No amount of heroic action could solve the philosophical problem of whether protection was worth imprisonment, whether safety justified the removal of choice. Different humans would answer that question differently based on their values and experiences and what they wanted from life. Some humans did choose to leave after the crisis stabilized, wanting to see what existed beyond the safe boundaries, willing to risk danger for the chance of genuine experience. Others chose to stay, valuing safety over adventure, preferring known constraints to unknown possibilities. The island society wouldn't collapse. It was too stable, too efficient, too successful at keeping people alive and comfortable. But it would change, become slightly less absolute in its isolation, develop fractures in its perfect control that would grow over time into genuine cracks in the protective philosophy. Finn's choice to return to Ooo was clear, but not without sadness and complicated feelings. He'd found his biological mother, learned his origin story, seen what humans became without magic and monsters shaping their development. But none of it felt like home the way the treehouse felt like home, the way adventuring with Jake felt right and natural, the way helping Princess Bubblegum or hanging out with Marceline felt comfortable. The islands were interesting, historically important, and genuinely where he came from biologically. But Ooo was where he belonged psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, in whatever way those concepts had meaning. Identity wasn't about biology or species, it was about choices and connections and the life you built, rather than the life you were born into. He said goodbye to Minerva knowing they'd probably never see each other again, knowing she existed in a digital afterlife serving people who valued safety over experience, knowing his choice to leave hurt her, but was still the right choice for who he actually was. Minerva tried once more to convince him to stay, cycling through logical arguments about safety and statistical dangers and reasonable precautions. But ultimately she accepted his decision, told him she was proud of who he'd become, expressed hope that he'd survive the dangerous life he'd chosen. The goodbye was gentle but final, mother and son connected by biology, but separated by fundamentally different worldviews about what made life worth living. Jake's relief when they sailed back toward Ooo was obvious and unashamed. He'd been terrified the entire time that Finn would want to stay on the islands, that finally finding other humans would make his brother realize he belonged somewhere else, somewhere Jake couldn't follow because he wasn't human and wouldn't fit in human society. The journey back home was lighter somehow, both of them knowing they'd made the right choice, that Ooo was where they belonged regardless of biology or species or what made logical sense. They talked about it during the long sailing days, about family and identity, about choosing your life rather than accepting what circumstances handed you, about how the people who raised you mattered infinitely more than genetic connection to people you'd never known. The island's visit changed Finn's understanding of himself in subtle but permanent ways. He wasn't the last human anymore. He was a human who chose Ooo over human civilization, who valued freedom and weirdness and danger over safety and order and control. His identity wasn't human in a magical world, but rather hero in the world he chose. And the distinction mattered fundamentally to how he saw himself. He returned to the Land of Ooo carrying stories about where he came from, carrying knowledge about his mother and his origins, but those stories were history now rather than defining truths. His future was still in the treehouse, still adventuring with Jake, still being Finn the human rather than Finn the human, trying to figure out where he belonged among his own species. He belonged in Ooo, and knowing that with certainty after seeing the alternative felt like finally answering a question he'd been carrying unconsciously his entire life. The Land of Ooo had survived the Lich, dimensional chaos, and cosmic threats, but it had never faced a transformation quite like this. The crisis began not with an invasion or an ancient evil awakening, but with something breaking loose inside the planet itself. Elemental magic that had been balanced and dormant for centuries suddenly surging out of control, rewriting entire regions according to pure primal forces. This wasn't destruction in the way the Mushroom War had been destruction, wasn't extinction like the Lich threatened. This was transformation on a fundamental level. Reality being overwritten by candy, slime, fire, and ice energies that didn't recognize or care about the civilizations that had been built on top of them. Finn and Jake had been away when it started, off on an ocean voyage dealing with some minor crisis that felt important at the time but would become completely irrelevant compared to what was happening back home. When they finally returned to Ooo, sailing back toward familiar shores, they found a land that looked familiar from a distance but felt wrong in ways that became clearer the closer they got. The colors were too intense, too pure, whole regions glowing with elemental energy that made the air itself seem thick and strange. As they traveled inland from the coast, the wrongness intensified, landscapes transforming before their eyes into extreme versions of themselves. Elements asserting dominance over everything that had been built through centuries of compromise and balance. The Candy Kingdom had been transformed into something that was still technically candy, but amplified to an uncomfortable extreme. Everything was pink and sweet and cheerful in ways that felt forced and overwhelming, citizens smiling with expressions that didn't quite reach their eyes, speaking in overly enthusiastic tones about how wonderful everything was now that candy magic had made everything perfect. Princess Bubblegum herself had been changed, not just physically, but mentally, her scientific rationality overwhelmed by pure candy essence, her controlling tendencies amplified into something more innocent but also more absolute. She wanted everyone to be happy and sweet and perfect, and the elemental magic that gave her the power to make that happen whether people consented or not. Finn's reaction to seeing Bubblegum transformed was immediate distress. This wasn't his friend anymore. Or rather, it was his friend with everything he valued about her, the intelligence, the complexity, the slightly dark pragmatism, stripped away, leaving only the surface sweetness amplified to the point of being disturbing. She didn't recognize the problem, couldn't understand why Finn seemed upset. Everything was perfect now, she explained with unsettling cheer. Everyone was happy, everyone was sweet, everyone was exactly what they should be. The fact that people's individual personalities had been overwritten to achieve this perfection didn't register as a problem to her transformed consciousness. The Fire Kingdom had gone full flame, everything burning in endless conflagration that somehow sustained itself without consuming the land entirely. Flame Princess had been amplified into something more primal, her careful control and personal growth burned away, leaving only pure fire essence that responded to emotion with immediate combustion. She wasn't evil or trying to hurt anyone, she was just fire being fire, following its nature without the restraint that came from also being a person with goals and relationships and understanding of consequences. The entire kingdom blazed with intensity that made it dangerous to approach, air shimmering with heat, everything expressed through flame and burning. The Ice Kingdom expanded dramatically as ice magic surged. Glaciers, fissures forming and spreading across regions that had been temperate or warm. The Ice King was amplified too, his already confused consciousness pushed further into pure ice essence, crystalline and cold and even less capable of human connection than before. He created ice constructs and frozen sculptures with abandon, building palaces and monuments that expressed ice's nature without any of the pathetic attempts at companionship that had defined his previous behavior. It was the Ice King without the sad human remnants, just cold magic doing what cold magic did, beautiful and deadly and completely indifferent to anyone who might freeze in its presence. The Slime Kingdom, which had existed more as scattered territories than a proper kingdom, surged into dominance across whole regions, viscous pools and flowing slime absorbing and transforming everything they touched. Slime Princess, usually cheerful and harmless in her limited way, became an overwhelming presence, slime magic spreading with patient inevitability, converting solid ground into fluid pools where traditional physics stopped applying and everything became mutable and uncertain. Walking through slime-transformed regions meant sinking and struggling and never being quite sure if the ground would support your weight, or if you'd dissolve into the viscous substance that was rapidly becoming the new default state of matter. Finn and Jake moved through this transformed Ooo with growing horror and determination, trying to understand what had happened and how to fix it. BMO, who had somehow avoided transformation by virtue of being a small robot rather than an organic being tied to elemental forces, explained what they'd missed. The elements had been balanced for centuries through careful arrangement and natural equilibrium, each force present but contained. Then something had disrupted that balance, whether through magical accident, ancient curse activation, or just the inevitable consequence of living on a planet where reality was thin and magic was strong. Once disrupted, the elements surged to their natural extremes, each one trying to dominate and convert everything to its own nature. The people they knew were all still there, but fundamentally changed, their personalities overwritten by elemental magic that didn't recognize individuality as valuable compared to purity of essence. Marceline had been transformed into something tied to one of the elements. The exact details varied by region, but she wasn't herself. Wasn't the complicated ancient vampire they knew, but rather a simpler version expressing only one aspect of existence. LSP, Lumpy Space Princess, turned out to be immune to the transformation due to being from the lumpy space dimension, her lumpy essence somehow resistant to elemental conversion, making her one of the few familiar beings still capable of acting like herself, though her help was chaotic and self-centered as always. The quest to restore balance required traveling through all the elemental kingdoms, understanding what each element had become in its pure state, and finding ways to remind the transformed inhabitants of who they'd been before magic overwrote their identities. It wasn't about fighting. You couldn't punch elements into submission, couldn't defeat fire or ice or candy or slime through normal heroics. Instead, Finn and Jake had to work with what each element had become, find the points where restoration was possible, and trust that the people they cared about still existed somewhere underneath the elemental transformation, waiting for the right stimulus to resurface. In the Candy Kingdom, Finn tried reaching Princess Bubblegum by referencing shared experiences and scientific interests that defined her beyond just being candy. He talked about experiments they'd done together, problems she'd solved through intelligence and planning, moments where her complexity and slightly dark pragmatism had made the difference between success and failure. The elemental version of Bubblegum resisted at first, insisting that science was less important than being sweet and perfect, that thinking too hard was counterproductive to the happiness candy essence provided. But slowly, fragments of the real Bubblegum surfaced. Curiosity about problems that couldn't be solved through cheerfulness, irritation at inefficiency and waste, the fundamental drive to understand and control that defined her core self more deeply than any elemental magic could reach. The process was repeated across other kingdoms with varying degrees of success and difficulty. Flame Princess required being reminded of growth beyond pure fire, of the person she'd chosen to become through effort and painful experience, of relationships and goals that meant more than just burning bright and hot. The Ice King was hardest because he'd already been partially lost to magic for centuries. The crown's influence mixed with elemental transformation until there was barely anything of Simon left to reach. But they tried anyway, using memories and music and the few things that sometimes broke through the Ice King's confusion to touch the human underneath. Jake's role throughout this crisis was different from his usual approach. He couldn't stretch his way through elemental transformation, couldn't provide comic relief that would lighten the mood when everything felt wrong and disturbing. Instead, he had to be steady and supportive, had to believe when Finn started doubting whether restoration was possible, had to maintain hope that their friends still existed underneath the elements. Jake also dealt with his own fear about what would happen if they failed, if Ooo remained permanently transformed into these pure elemental extremes, where individuals became aspects of larger forces, where everyone he loved stopped being themselves and became expressions of candy or fire or ice or slime. The solution, when they finally assembled all the pieces, involved restoring elemental balance rather than eliminating elemental magic entirely. The elements were part of Oo's nature, foundational to how the land worked at deep levels. You couldn't remove them without destroying the world itself. But you could reestablish equilibrium, remind each element that it existed alongside others, that balance meant coexistence rather than dominance. It required accessing the elemental source, an ancient place where the four primary elements connected to the planet's core, where balance had first been established eons ago, and where it could be restored now if someone was brave enough to reach it and make the necessary adjustments. Finn descended into this elemental source with Jake, BMO, and the few allies who'd remained unchanged. The journey took them through layers of reality where physics became optional and elemental forces manifested as living presences, conscious but alien, operating according to logics that predated life itself. Fire wanted to burn, ice wanted to freeze, candy wanted to assimilate into sweetness, slime wanted to dissolve boundaries between things. None of these desires were evil, they were just what elements did, their fundamental nature expressed without the constraints that civilization and balance imposed. Convincing them to accept limits again, to coexist rather than dominate, required arguments that elements could understand. Sustainability, diversity, the richness that came from multiple forces interacting rather than one force consuming everything. When balance was finally restored, through a combination of Finn's determination, Jake's support, and adjustments to the elemental source that nobody fully understood but that seemed to work, the transformation reversed across Ooo. Not instantly, not like flipping a switch, but gradually, like snow melting in spring. People's personalities returned, individuality reasserting itself over elemental purity. Princess Bubblegum woke from the candy transformation, confused and embarrassed about her behavior, while under elemental influence, immediately analyzing what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. Flame Princess regained her hard-won control and personal identity, remembering who she'd chosen to be beyond just fire. Even the Ice King returned to his normal, confused state, which wasn't great, but was at least familiar and manageable. The Candy Kingdom recovered with its usual resilience, citizens processing their experience of having been transformed into pure candy essence and controlled by elemental magic, trying to figure out how much of what they'd done under that influence counted as their own choices. Bubblegum implemented new systems immediately, wards and monitors and contingencies designed to detect elemental surges before they could overwhelm balance again. She'd been violated by the transformation, had lost control of herself in ways that echoed her possession by the Lich, but felt different, less invasive but more complete, her consciousness not stolen but rewritten into something simple and pure and wrong. The experience made her even more committed to maintaining control and order, more convinced that safety required constant vigilance and systems that could catch problems before they escalated into crises. For Finn, the element's crisis reinforced something he'd been learning gradually. Sometimes the enemy was family. Sometimes the people you loved became threats, not through choice but through forces beyond their control, and saving them meant working with rather than against what they'd become. He'd fought Princess Bubblegum's transformed state by reminding her of complexity, had helped Flame Princess by acknowledging her growth, had tried right with the Ice King even though success was partial and uncertain. It was harder than fighting monsters because monsters were supposed to be fought, while friends transformed by magic required different skills. Patience, empathy, willingness to reach for people who'd been temporarily overwritten by forces that didn't respect individuality. Jake came out of the experience shaken by how easily everything he knew could be transformed, how thin the line was between Ooo as home and Ooo as a land of pure elemental extremes, where people stopped being people and became aspects of larger forces. He held his puppies tighter afterward, checked in on Lady Rainicorn more frequently, made sure the connections that mattered to him were maintained and strengthened, because the crisis had proven how quickly those connections could be severed by forces nobody saw coming. The treehouse felt more precious now, more like a sanctuary that required active protection rather than just a place that would always be there no matter what happened. The land itself settled back into balance, but carried scars from the transformation. Regions where elemental magic had permanently altered the landscape in small ways, places where candy or fire or ice or slime had left marks that wouldn't fully fade. Ooo had survived another crisis, had proven that even fundamental transformation could be reversed if people cared enough and fought smart enough. But everyone was aware now that the world could be overwritten at any time, that balance was maintained through constant adjustment rather than being naturally stable, and that the magic that made Ooo wonderful was also the magic that made it dangerous in ways that normal worlds didn't have to worry about. Not all threats came from ancient evil or cosmic forces or elemental imbalance. Sometimes danger grew from smaller mistakes, from magic going wrong in ways nobody predicted, from attempts to help that created problems more complicated than the original issue. Fern's existence began during one of Finn's encounters with the grass demon. A curse that had infected him, tried to take over his body, threatened to replace Finn with something that wore his shape but operated according to alien green logic. When the grass curse was finally removed and destroyed, something unexpected happened. The destroyed curse, still carrying Finn's essence and memories from when it had been connected to him, reformed into a separate being. Fern was born as an alternate Finn, a copy made from magic and grass and stolen identity, conscious and confused, and fundamentally uncertain about what he was or where he belonged. From Fern's perspective, he was Finn. He had Finn's memories, Finn's skills, Finn's relationships and experiences all stored in his grass body mind. He remembered growing up with Jake, remembered adventures and dangers and moments that defined Finn's life. But he also knew he wasn't the original, knew he was a copy or a curse remnant, or something created rather than born. That knowledge created an identity crisis that couldn't be solved through normal means. How do you build a self when you're not sure if your memories are truly yours or just stolen data? How do you relate to people who look at you and see someone else, someone they care about, but who isn't you, who exists separately and takes priority simply by being original? Finn tried to help Fern in the way he approached most problems, with direct action and good intentions. He invited Fern to live at the treehouse, tried to include him in adventures, attempted to treat him as a brother or friend rather than as a copy or curse. But every interaction reminded both of them of the fundamental weirdness of the situation. When Finn talked about past adventures, Fern remembered them too, but from inside his head rather than as shared experiences. When Jake made jokes that referenced their history, Fern laughed along but felt increasingly disconnected, aware that the joke was about a relationship he remembered but hadn't actually lived. The memories were there, but the experiences weren't his, and the distinction grew heavier with every passing day. Princess Bubblegum tried approaching the problem scientifically, analyzing Fern's composition and nature, trying to understand if he was truly a separate being or just an extension of Finn's essence given temporary form. Her research was thorough but cold in the way her scientific approach often was, treating Fern as an interesting problem rather than a person experiencing genuine existential crisis. She concluded that Fern was technically a distinct entity, separate enough to have his own choices and consciousness, but fundamentally tied to Finn in ways that made true independence impossible. It was meant to be reassuring. You're real, you're your own person, but it felt like a technicality, a scientific verdict that didn't address the emotional reality of being a copy of someone else. Fern's struggle with identity manifested in increasingly dangerous ways. He tried being his own person, doing different things than Finn would do, making different choices and having different opinions. But the effort felt performative, like acting in a play where the role was person who isn't Finn, rather than discovering who he actually was beneath the copied personality. He tried adventures on his own, helping people without Finn present, proving he could be heroic independently. But citizens kept calling him Finn, kept expecting him to act like Finn, kept treating him as a substitute rather than an individual. The frustration built like pressure in a sealed container, nowhere to release, no solution that would let him be genuinely himself rather than Finn's shadow. The grass curse that formed Fern's body wasn't dead or dormant. It was contained, forming the structure of his being, but still carrying its original nature of transformation and replacement. As Fern's psychological state deteriorated, as frustration and identity crisis and resentment built up without release, the grass curse responded by growing stronger, feeding on his negative emotions, slowly overwhelming whatever made Fern separate from the magic that shaped him. He started changing, literally, grass spreading across his body in patterns that looked like infection or corruption, his thoughts becoming less coherent, his actions more driven by the curse's original purpose of replacing Finn entirely. The conflict escalated gradually, Fern trying to assert his independence while simultaneously being driven by the curse to eliminate Finn and take his place, to prove he was the real one, or at least that he deserved to exist without being constantly compared to someone else. Jake watched this unfold with growing concern, wanting to help but unsure how to help someone whose core problem was existing in the first place, whose suffering came from circumstances no amount of stretchy heroics could fix. Fern needed to be real, needed to matter on his own terms, needed the world to see him as Fern, rather than as Copy Finn or Grass Curse Finn or any other designation that defined him primarily through relationship to someone else. The arc toward full crisis was painful to witness because both Finn and Fern were sympathetic, both dealing with impossible situations neither had chosen. Finn wanted to help, wanted to give Fern space and identity and recognition, but his very existence was the problem. As long as Finn was around being Finn, Fern would always be measured against him, would always be the copy trying to prove equivalence with an original who didn't need to prove anything. Fern wanted to be good, wanted to be heroic and helpful and someone people valued. But the grass curse kept pulling him toward violence and replacement, kept suggesting that the only way to truly be himself was to eliminate the person he'd been copied from and take over his life entirely. The final confrontation was tragic and inevitable, taking place in locations around Ooo that mattered to Finn's history, places that Fern remembered but hadn't actually experienced in the way real memories worked. They fought not because either wanted to, but because Fern's corruption had reached a point where the grass curse controlled more of him than his own consciousness did, where the drive to replace Finn overwhelmed any other consideration. Finn fought defensively, trying to contain rather than destroy, trying to save Fern from the curse that was consuming him from inside. But Fern's attacks were desperate and increasingly uncontrolled. Grass magic spreading and corrupting, transforming the battlefield into something organic and wrong. Jake's involvement in the fight was reluctant and pained, stretching to protect Finn while also trying not to hurt Fern more than necessary, trying to find some solution that would save everyone even as it became increasingly clear that no such solution existed. Princess Bubblegum intervened with scientific solutions, magical dampeners, and anti-grass compounds, but the curse was too deep and too integrated with what made Fern exist at all. Attacking the curse meant attacking Fern's structural integrity, and there was no clear line where curse ended and person began. They were trying to save someone who might not be separable from the thing killing him, which was its own kind of horror. The resolution came when Fern, in a moment of clarity between waves of curse-driven violence, made his own choice. He couldn't keep existing like this, couldn't keep hurting people while trying to figure out who he was, couldn't continue the cycle of being driven by magic he couldn't control toward outcomes he didn't want. In that moment of clarity, he asked Finn to end it, to stop the curse permanently, even if that meant ending Fern himself. It was the only choice that felt truly his own, not predetermined by the curse, not influenced by being a copy of Finn, just Fern deciding that this was how his story should end, with agency and sacrifice rather than corruption and violence. Finn's response was immediate refusal. He couldn't kill Fern, couldn't end someone who was essentially a brother or alternate self, couldn't accept that death was the only solution. But Fern was insistent, and as the grass curse surged again, taking control and driving Fern toward attacks that would hurt or kill people they both cared about, Finn had to make the impossible choice. He struck the final blow not out of anger or heroism, but out of mercy, stopping Fern because Fern had asked him to, because letting the curse continue was worse than ending a life that had been tragic and confused from the moment it began. Fern's death was quiet compared to the violence that preceded it. The grass body collapsed, the curse energy dissipated, and what remained was just a small tree sprouting where Fern had fallen. A literal transformation. Curse magic, converting into something gentler and more natural. Finn stood over the small tree for a long time, not speaking, not moving, processing what he'd just done and what it meant. He'd killed someone who'd had his memories, who'd wanted to be heroic, who'd struggled with identity and purpose in ways that Finn could understand, even if he'd never experienced them directly. The weight of that settled heavy and didn't lift, a new kind of grief that normal hero work had never prepared him for. Jake's comfort was present, but quiet. Just being there rather than trying to fix emotions that couldn't be fixed with words or jokes or philosophical observations. They planted flowers around the small tree that had been Fern, marked the spot as important even though nobody else would know exactly what had happened here or who the tree represented. The treehouse felt emptier afterward. One more room that had been occupied briefly before tragedy made it vacant again. One more reminder that trying to do good didn't always produce good outcomes, that some problems couldn't be solved no matter how hard you tried or how much you cared. The Fern arc left Finn with understanding that being a hero sometimes meant making terrible choices, that mercy could look like violence, that loving someone could mean ending them when they asked you to because continuing was worse than stopping. It was a lesson nobody wanted to learn. A truth that sat uncomfortable next to all the simple victories and clear-cut good versus evil conflicts that had defined his early adventuring. Fern had been family in a weird, complicated way, had been someone trying to figure out existence just like Finn was trying to figure out existence, and the fact that his story ended in mercy killing rather than resolution felt wrong in ways that would never fully stop hurting. As Ooo settled into what passed for stability after the Elements crisis and Fern's tragedy, old tensions and new conflicts rose to fill the breathing room. Princess Bubblegum's methods, The surveillance, the control, the contingency plans for every possible threat had kept her kingdom safe through multiple existential crises, but those same methods were creating resentment and political friction that couldn't be ignored forever. Other kingdoms looked at the Candy Kingdom's security systems and saw not protection, but paranoia, saw not preparation, but assumption that everyone was a potential threat requiring monitoring and management. What Bubblegum considered necessary precautions, her neighbors increasingly viewed as hostile overreach. The Fire Kingdom under Flame, Princess's rule, had particular grievances, remembering how the Candy Kingdom had interfered in their affairs, how Bubblegum had given Finn advice designed to prevent his relationship with Flame Princess rather than support it, how candy scientists studied fire magic like it was a problem to solve rather than a natural force to respect. Flame Princess had matured as a ruler, had learned to control her power and lead her kingdom with more wisdom than her father ever had. But she hadn't forgotten the patronizing attitude the Candy Kingdom sometimes showed toward smaller or less technologically advanced kingdoms. When diplomatic disputes arose over territory or resources or political alliances, old resentments flared alongside the practical conflicts. Finn found himself caught in the middle of these tensions, loyal to Princess Bubblegum, but also aware that her approach to security and governance had genuine problems, that her need for control sometimes went beyond reasonable caution into territory that made other kingdoms feel threatened rather than safe. He tried mediating, tried explaining each side's perspective to the other, tried being the bridge between kingdoms that were drifting toward conflict. But Finn wasn't a diplomat. He was a hero trained to fight monsters and explore dungeons, not navigate political complexity or mediate between rulers who had centuries-old grudges and very different ideas about how power should be used. Jake was less interested in the politics but more attuned to the interpersonal dynamics, noticing how Bubblegum's stress manifested in increased control attempts, how Flame Princess's anger at past slights was influencing her current decisions, how other kingdoms were choosing sides or staying neutral based on calculations about power, rather than considerations about what was actually right. He tried keeping Finn grounded, reminding him that they didn't have to solve every problem or fix every conflict, that sometimes kingdoms had to work out their own issues without heroes intervening, but Finn's instinct was always to help, always to throw himself at problems, even when the problems were political rather than physical, even when heroic intervention might make things worse rather than better. The conflict escalated when the Candy Kingdom implemented new security measures that other kingdoms saw as threatening. Bubblegum developed weapon systems designed to neutralize various magical threats. Fire suppression technology for Fire Kingdom attacks, anti-ice measures for Ice Kingdom problems, defenses against slime or other elemental incursions. From her perspective, these were reasonable precautions given the element's crisis and various invasions the Candy Kingdom had suffered. From other kingdoms' perspectives, these looked like preparations for conquest, or at minimum evidence that the Candy Kingdom viewed all its neighbors as potential enemies requiring countermeasures. Diplomatic meetings became tense, formal affairs where representatives spoke carefully and took offense easily, where every statement was analyzed for hidden meaning or implied threat. King of Ooo, a con artist who had briefly taken control of the Candy Kingdom during one of Bubblegum's forced absences, stirred up trouble by suggesting that Bubblegum's authoritarian tendencies were dangerous, that the Candy Kingdom needed new leadership, that other kingdoms should support his claim to rule rather than allowing Bubblegum to consolidate power further. His arguments were self-serving and built on lies, but they found audience among rulers who were already nervous about the Candy Kingdom's growing military and technological capabilities. The situation degraded into something approaching war, not full-scale battle, but skirmishes and provocations, small conflicts that could escalate into larger ones if someone miscalculated or lost control. The Fire Kingdom sent troops to disputed border regions, claiming they were just defending their territory but positioned in ways that looked aggressive from the Candy Kingdom's perspective. The Candy Kingdom activated defense systems that other kingdoms interpreted as preparation to attack. Smaller kingdoms chose sides or declared neutrality, and suddenly Ooo had something it hadn't really experienced in recent memory: organized political conflict between multiple kingdoms with genuine military capabilities. Finn tried preventing war through individual heroics, putting out fires literal and metaphorical, stopping skirmishes before they escalated, desperately trying to find peaceful solutions to conflicts that had deep roots and legitimate grievances on multiple sides. But heroism designed for fighting monsters didn't translate well to preventing wars between kingdoms that had reasonable concerns and competing interests. You couldn't punch a political conflict into submission, couldn't solve deep-seated distrust through brave individual actions, couldn't make complicated problems simple just by trying really hard to fix them. Princess Bubblegum's response to the growing conflict was to tighten control further, implement more security measures, prepare the Candy Kingdom for potential war while simultaneously insisting she wanted peace. Her logic was consistent with her worldview. Show strength, prepare for worst-case scenarios, make it clear that attacking the Candy Kingdom would be costly enough that nobody would try it. But this approach just made other kingdoms more nervous, confirmed their suspicions that Bubblegum saw herself as Oo's rightful supreme ruler, created a self-fulfilling prophecy where preparation for conflict generated the conflict it was supposed to prevent. The crisis point came when multiple factors converged into a situation that threatened to explode into full war. The King of Oo's manipulations created circumstances where kingdoms that should have been neutral were picking sides, where old alliances were breaking and new ones forming along lines that made large-scale conflict likely. Ancient threats stirred in response to the chaos, seeing opportunity in kingdoms focused on each other rather than on external dangers. And underneath everything, the Candy Kingdom's gumball guardians, massive defense constructs Bubblegum had created to protect her people, stood ready to activate, to crush any threat with overwhelming force, symbols of both safety and oppression, depending on which side of their protection you stood on. Finn's desperation peaked when he realized that individual heroics weren't going to prevent this war, that the conflicts were too big and too justified, on multiple sides, for one person to solve. Jake stood beside him through these attempts, stretching to help however he could, but even Jake's usual optimism was strained by the scope of the problem. They'd faced cosmic threats and death incarnate, but those had clear solutions. Stop the Lich, prevent the comet absorption, restore elemental balance. This was messier, more complicated, with no obvious villain. To defeat, or clear right answer to discover, just kingdoms with legitimate concerns making reasonable decisions that collectively pushed everyone toward violence. The resolution came not through fighting, but through exhaustion, negotiation, and Princess Bubblegum finally acknowledging that her approach to security was creating the dangers it was meant to prevent. The specific details involved diplomatic summits, concessions from multiple kingdoms, agreements about borders and surveillance and military buildups that nobody was completely happy with, but everyone could accept as preferable to war. Bubblegum agreed to dismantle some of her more aggressive security systems, to operate with more transparency about her defensive capabilities, to accept that other kingdoms had legitimate reasons to fear her power and control. But the concessions cost her something fundamental: the certainty that her way was right, that more control meant more safety, that preparation and vigilance could prevent all disasters. She'd built her entire approach to ruling around those assumptions, and having to acknowledge their limitations felt like failure even when it was actually growth. Finn watched her struggle with this, saw how hard it was for someone who'd survived centuries through careful planning and control to accept that sometimes less control produced better outcomes, that trust was occasionally more effective than surveillance, that appearing less threatening could make you actually safer. The aftermath left the kingdoms in uneasy peace, aware that the conflicts had exposed real divisions and genuine grievances that treaties couldn't fully resolve. The Candy Kingdom remained powerful but less dominant, more willing to operate as one kingdom among many rather than as Oo's de facto authority. Flame Princess's Fire Kingdom gained respect and recognition, no longer dismissed as a minor player in Ooo politics. Smaller kingdoms learned that they could assert their own interests, that the balance of power wasn't fixed and unchangeable, that the future of Ooo would be negotiated rather than determined by whoever had the most advanced candy science. For Finn, the experience reinforced something he'd been learning gradually throughout his adventures. Being a hero didn't mean having answers to every problem, didn't mean being able to fix everything through courage and determination, didn't mean that wanting peace was enough to create it. Some problems were too big for individual action, required collective solutions and compromises that felt unsatisfying compared to clear victories against obvious evil. He remained committed to helping people, but he understood now that helping sometimes meant supporting messy political processes rather than charging into battle, meant accepting partial solutions rather than insisting on perfect outcomes. Jake's takeaway was simpler, but no less important. Kingdoms were going to do what kingdoms did, and trying to prevent that from happening through heroic intervention was often futile or counterproductive. Better to focus on people you could actually help, on problems where individual action made a difference, on maintaining the relationships and connections that mattered, regardless of what political structures did above and around them. The treehouse remained their base, and within it they could build something good even when the world outside was complicated and frustrating and resistant to simple solutions. Everything converged in ways nobody had fully predicted. Old conflicts and new dangers and ancient forces colliding into a crisis that felt like culmination, like the land itself had been building toward this moment through all the wars and transformations and quiet recoveries that had defined Oo's strange history. The catalyst was Golb, not a villain in any traditional sense, but a cosmic entity of chaos and change that existed beyond normal categories of good or evil, a force that brought dissolution and transformation, that unmade things simply because that's what Golb did, the universe's mechanism for ending and restarting, for ensuring nothing remained static or permanent for too long. Golb's arrival wasn't invasion or attack. It was more like weather, like a storm that doesn't hate anyone but destroys everything in its path through sheer indifference. The entity manifested in the sky above Ooo, massive and incomprehensible, a presence that made reality feel unstable just by existing in the same space. Its influence began immediately, structures dissolving, magic becoming unpredictable, the fundamental rules that kept Ooo functioning starting to break down under the weight of cosmic chaos. This wasn't the Lich's patient extinction or elemental imbalance or political conflict. This was reality itself coming apart, and every kingdom, every faction, every individual that had been at odds moments before suddenly had to cooperate or face collective erasure. The Candy Kingdom mobilized immediately, Princess Bubblegum activating every defense system and contingency plan she'd developed across centuries of ruling. The Gumball Guardians rose to full combat readiness, massive candy constructs programmed to protect the kingdom at all costs. But as they moved to engage Golb's influence, it became clear that normal defenses meant nothing against a force that operated on cosmic scales, that dissolved structure itself as its basic function. The Guardians struck at chaos and accomplished nothing. Their carefully programmed tactics useless against something that didn't follow rules they could predict or counter. The Fire Kingdom brought Flame Princess leading her people in attempts to burn away Golb's corrupting influence. But fire couldn't burn chaos. Chaos just spread through the flames, made them unpredictable and dangerous, turned controlled burning into wild conflagration that threatened allies as much as it attacked the cosmic threat. The Ice Kingdom contributed frozen barriers and Arctic cold, the Ice King using his crown's power with unusual focus, but ice shattered against Golb's presence, structure breaking into fragments that dissolved before they hit the ground. Finn and Jake found themselves at the center of the crisis not through planning, but through the simple fact that they responded to danger instinctively, charged toward the threat when everyone else was still processing what they faced. They couldn't fight Golb directly. You can't punch cosmic chaos, can't defeat a fundamental force of universal change through courage or determination alone. But they could help people, could coordinate efforts across kingdoms that had been at odds hours earlier, could be the connective tissue that held together a defensive effort involving fire people and candy citizens and ice constructs and slime creatures and every other weird faction that called Ooo home. The battle, if it could be called a battle when one side was an incomprehensible cosmic entity, spread across multiple fronts and regarded in reality simultaneously. Golb's influence didn't follow spatial logic, didn't move like armies or spread like fire. It manifested wherever existence was vulnerable, wherever the fabric of reality was thin enough that chaos could push through. Small pockets of dissolution appeared across Ooo, places where things simply stopped being in any coherent way, where matter and magic and memory broke down into formless chaos. Defenders tried containing these pockets, but containing chaos was like trying to hold water in a net. Possible briefly, but ultimately futile without changing the fundamental approach. The Ice King's story reached its turning point during the crisis, centuries of curse and madness finally intersecting with a moment that demanded resolution. Betty, Simon's long-lost love who'd been pulled through time and dimensions years ago, had been searching across realities for ways to save Simon from the crown's curse, to restore the man she loved from underneath the Ice King's insanity. Now, with Golb's presence making reality flexible and magic unpredictable, she saw an opportunity. Not a safe opportunity, not a guaranteed solution, but a chance to use cosmic chaos to break a curse that had resisted every conventional attempt to lift it. The process of separating Simon from the crown involved magic that went beyond what anyone fully understood, reaching into the crown's ancient structure and pulling apart the connections that had fused Simon's survival to its power. Betty worked with Princess Bubblegum's scientific magic and various mystical entities that had been drawn to Golby's presence, creatures from other dimensions that understood chaos better than Oo's residents did. The separation was agonizing to witness. Simon screaming as centuries of magical corruption were forcibly removed, the Ice King's personality fragmenting and dissolving, the crown itself cracking as power that had sustained it for millennia was redirected and transformed. When the process completed, Simon Petrikov stood in the Ice King's place, human again, mortal again, wearing glasses and looking confused and ancient and fundamentally exhausted. He was free from the crown's curse after wearing it for longer than most civilizations lasted, finally himself again in ways that should have felt triumphant, but mostly felt disorienting and strange. The world he'd been insane in for centuries still existed, but he existed in it now as a human who remembered everything, who carried the weight of every confused action he'd taken as the Ice King, every kidnapping and delusion and moment of pathetic loneliness that had defined his cursed existence. But freedom came at a cost, because magic always demanded balance, and Betty's solution required sacrifice. The power that had been sustaining Simon, that had kept him alive through centuries, had to go somewhere or do something. It couldn't just dissipate without consequence. Betty made a choice in that moment. A decision she didn't fully explain or discuss because there wasn't time, and because she knew Simon would try to stop her if he understood. She took the curse's remnants, merged herself with Golby in ways that transformed both her and the cosmic entity, became something that was neither Betty nor Golb, but a new synthesis that contained elements of both. Simon's reaction when he realized what Betty had done was raw grief and helpless rage. He'd been freed from his curse, but at the cost of losing her again, watching the woman he'd loved disappear into cosmic transformation to save him. The cruel irony was obvious. Betty had spent years searching for ways to save Simon, and when she finally succeeded, the solution consumed her, turned her into something as distant and strange as Simon had been when he was the Ice King. They'd traded places in a sense. Simon restored to humanity while Betty became something beyond human, beyond even the categories of existence that Ooo operated within. Marceline witnessed Simon's restoration with emotions she couldn't fully sort through or express. She'd known Simon as a child, had watched him lose himself to the crown, had spent centuries dealing with the Ice King while knowing the man she'd loved as a father figure was trapped inside. Now Simon was back, but centuries had passed, and the little girl he'd protected was an ancient vampire with her own complicated life and traumas. Their reunion was tender but awkward, both of them aware that time and transformation had changed them in ways that couldn't be reversed just because the curse was broken. Simon remembered her as a child. Marceline remembered him as a protector. Neither of those people existed anymore except in memory. The larger battle against Golb's influence continued even as these personal transformations unfolded. Betty's merger with the cosmic entity changed the nature of the threat, introduced complexity where there had been only chaos. Golby Betty began removing threats, addressing problems, operating with something that resembled intentionality rather than pure cosmic indifference. But the method was still dissolution and transformation, still breaking things down to their essence and remaking them according to logic that mortals couldn't fully grasp or predict. The universe was being adjusted, reality edited, and everyone caught in the process had to trust that the adjustments would leave them recognizably themselves, rather than transform beyond recognition. Finn found himself facing his own moment of choice during the crisis, a situation where his cosmic significance as a former Catalyst incarnation gave him potential influence over reality that he'd previously rejected. He could lean into that power, could become something more than human to affect the outcome of cosmic-level events, could sacrifice his individual identity for the good of everyone. But he'd already rejected that path once, had chosen to remain Finn rather than becoming a force of universal change. Now, with everything on the line, he had to decide if that choice still stood or if circumstances required him to reconsider. Jake stood beside him through the decision, ready to support whatever Finn chose, but also silently hoping his brother would stay Finn, would remain on the person Jake knew rather than ascending to cosmic significance. The pressure was immense. People were dying, reality was breaking, and Finn had power inside him that could potentially help if he was willing to stop being human. But Finn chose himself again, chose limitation and mortality and the specific life he'd built, trusting that being Finn the hero was enough even when cosmic forces suggested he could be more. It was the same choice as before, but harder now, more costly, because the stakes were higher and the consequences of choosing wrong were more immediate. The resolution came through combined efforts and sacrifices from multiple sources. The kingdoms worked together despite their differences, contributing what they could to stabilizing reality against Golb's dissolving influence. Golby Betty's intervention, while alien and frightening, redirected the worst of the chaos away from populated areas, turned dissolution toward problems rather than indiscriminately toward everything. Prismo contributed from the Time Room, using his cosmic position to reinforce temporal stability while reality's spatial structure was under assault. Even the Lich's remnants, still existing in various sealed forms across dimensions, were drawn into the crisis and somehow neutralized or transformed, ancient evil becoming fuel for reality's restoration. When Golby finally departed, drawn away by Golby Betty, or simply finished with whatever cosmic purpose had brought it to Ooo, the land was left changed, but intact. Buildings were damaged, landscapes transformed, people displaced or confused, but existence itself had survived, had proven resilient enough to withstand cosmic chaos without completely breaking. The victory didn't feel triumphant because the cost had been high and personal. Simon restored, but Betty gone, kingdoms damaged, people lost, and the certainty that Ooo could survive anything permanently shaken by how close they'd come to dissolution. The immediate aftermath was exhausted relief rather than celebration. People returned to damaged homes and tried to rebuild. Kingdoms assessed losses and began recovery efforts. Individuals processed traumas and looked for loved ones who'd survived the chaos. Princess Bubblegum threw herself into reconstruction with typical intensity, directing resources and organizing repairs. But even she seemed quieter, more aware that control only went so far when cosmic forces decided to intervene. Flame Princess helped where fire could rebuild rather than destroy, her maturity as a ruler showing in how she balanced her kingdom's needs against collective recovery efforts. Simon Petrikov, meanwhile, had to figure out how to exist in a world that had moved on without him. He was human again, mortal again, but everyone he'd known before the crown was dead, and the world he remembered had been transformed by the Mushroom War and centuries of magical recovery. Marceline helped where she could, reintroduced him to Ooo as it currently existed, tried to bridge the gap between the Simon she remembered and the man standing before her now. But it was hard for both of them. Simon carried guilt and confusion about his centuries as the Ice King, while Marceline had to reconcile the protective father figure from her childhood with this elderly mortal who looked small and lost in a world he no longer understood. Finn and Jake returned to the treehouse when the crisis was finally over, when there was nothing more to do except rest and process what had happened. The house had survived with minimal damage, a small miracle given how much of Ooo had been affected. They sat in familiar spaces surrounded by familiar things, trying to feel normal when everything felt different. When the world had nearly ended and been saved through sacrifices they hadn't made but had witnessed. Jake made sandwiches because that's what he did when things were bad, and Finn ate them without really tasting anything, both of them aware that something fundamental had shifted in how they understood their place in Ooo and what heroism actually meant. The crisis had proven that individual heroes mattered to Finn, but couldn't save everything alone, that cosmic threats required cosmic solutions, that sometimes the best you could do was help people through disasters rather than preventing disasters entirely. It was a sobering realization for Finn, who'd spent his entire life believing that being brave enough and trying hard enough would let him fix any problem. Now he understood that some problems were bigger than individual effort, that the universe operated on scales where personal heroism was meaningful but not sufficient, that the best endings often involved loss and compromise rather than clean victory. Time passed in Ooo the way it always did, measured not in dates or years, but in seasons and changes, in how kingdoms rebuilt and relationships evolved, in the slow return to something resembling normal after cosmic crisis had shaken everything to its foundations. The land healed its physical wounds relatively quickly. Buildings were repaired, landscapes reshaped, damage addressed through effort and magic and simple determination. But the psychological wounds took longer, the understanding that everything could have ended, that existence itself was more fragile than anyone had wanted to believe, that the safety they'd assumed was really just temporary stability between crises. Princess Bubblegum's kingdom recovered with efficiency that was impressive and slightly disturbing, every repair planned and executed according to systems she'd developed for exactly this kind of situation. But something had changed in how she approached ruling. The near dissolution of reality had proven that no amount of preparation or control could prevent every disaster, that sometimes you just had to trust that people would survive and rebuild rather than trying to prevent all possible dangers in advance. She still planned, still prepared, still maintained, custom-maintained security systems and contingencies. But she also delegated more, trusted her citizens more, accepted that perfect safety was impossible, and pursuing it too aggressively created its own dangers. Marceline spent time with Simon, helping him adjust to being human again in a world that had become strange during his centuries as the Ice King. They rebuilt their relationship carefully, aware that they couldn't recapture what had existed before. She'd been a child then, he'd been whole then, and both of those people were gone. But they could build something new, a friendship between an ancient vampire and an elderly human who'd both survived more than most people could imagine, who understood each other's traumas in ways nobody else could. They played music together, Simon on drums while Marceline sang, creating something gentle and sad and healing through shared rhythm and melody. Finn and Jake continued adventuring, helping people with problems that felt manageable after cosmic threats and near apocalypses. They saved Candy citizens from monsters, explored dungeons that had been revealed or created by Golb's chaos, dealt with the Ice Kingdom's new instability now that the Ice King was gone and the Crown's power was scattered or dormant. But the adventures felt different now, less like the central purpose of existence and more like the work they did between moments of rest. Important but not consuming, heroic but not their entire identity. Jake's puppies were growing rapidly, developing into their own people with their own lives and goals. Some of them stayed close, remained involved in their parents' lives and adventures. Others moved away, started their own families or pursued their own interests, demonstrated that growing up meant sometimes leaving home and building separate lives. Jake processed this with mixed emotions. Pride that his children were independent and capable, but also grief at how quickly they'd gone from needing him constantly to barely needing him at all. Lady Rainicorn was better at accepting this transition, understanding that love meant letting people grow into themselves rather than holding them close forever. The world developed new heroes too. Younger people inspired by Finn and Jake's example or simply driven by their own desire to help others. They didn't replace Finn and Jake. Heroism wasn't a job with a single employee, but they supplemented them, took on adventures and problems in areas Finn and Jake couldn't cover, created a network of people trying to make Ooo better rather than just two brothers fighting everything alone. Finn watched these new heroes with approval and occasional advice, aware that he'd been doing this long enough that younger people saw him as a veteran, someone with experience worth learning from, rather than just another kid with a sword. BMO remained constant through all these changes, a small robot with mysterious origins and a heart bigger than physical size should allow. BMO organized movie nights at the treehouse, created games and stories that helped everyone process trauma through play and imagination, served as neutral ground, where people from different kingdoms could gather without political tension. BMO's consistent presence and innocent optimism became increasingly important as everyone else dealt with growing older, gaining experience, losing the certainty that had made early adventures feel simple. Finn's own aging was subtle but real, the physical changes that came with moving from teenager to young adult, his body developing in ways that made him stronger, but also reminded him that time passed, that the eternal present of childhood adventures was giving way to something more complex. He didn't feel old. He was still in his late teens or early 20s, still physically capable of heroics, but he felt the weight of everything he'd experienced, all the people he'd lost and hurt and saved and failed to save, accumulating into a kind of emotional gravity that made casual optimism harder to maintain. Jake aged differently, being a magical dog with stretchy powers that might or might not follow normal biological time. He seemed simultaneously younger and older than before, Goofier in some ways, more willing to embrace silliness and reject responsibility, but also wearier, more aware of mortality and limitations, more interested in spending time with family than charging into danger. The balance worked somehow, Jake being exactly who Finn needed him to be, while also being honest about his own changing priorities and interests. The Land of Ooo itself settled into a new configuration, kingdoms operating with more cooperation and less dominance hierarchy, power more distributed, borders more fluid. The Candy Kingdom remained influential, but not controlling. The Fire Kingdom gained respect. Smaller kingdoms asserted their own interests, and overall the land felt more like a collection of equals navigating shared space rather than a territory where one ruler set the tone for everyone. It wasn't perfect. Conflicts still arose, disagreements still happened, but the default was negotiation rather than assumed authority, cooperation rather than competition. Finn's influence on this transition was hard to measure, but definitely present. Years of helping everyone regardless of kingdom affiliation, of treating candy citizens and fire people and ice creatures and slime entities as equally deserving of heroic intervention, had created relationships and goodwill that made cooperation easier. People trusted Finn in ways they didn't necessarily trust their own rulers, saw him as genuinely invested in everyone's well-being, rather than pursuing kingdom-specific interests. That trust created space for dialogue and compromise, made it possible for kingdoms to work together because they'd all worked with Finn and knew cooperation was possible. This era wasn't defined by major crises or epic battles. It was recovery and reconstruction, small adventures and personal growth, the slow work of building something stable after everything had nearly fallen apart. Heroes still mattered a bit, but differently. Less as individuals who saved everything through dramatic action, and more as people who helped maintain the network of connections and care that kept society functioning. Finn adjusted to this role gradually, learning to value the quiet victories as much as the dramatic ones, understanding that stopping one person from hurting another mattered even when it didn't involve cosmic threats or ancient evil. The treehouse remained their base, but it felt more like a home now than an adventurer's outpost. It had accumulated memories and history, rooms that reminded them of specific eras and adventures, spaces that carried emotional weight beyond their physical function. Jake's room reflected his role as father and partner. Finn's room showed his journey from naive kid to experienced hero. BMO's corner was organized chaos of games and stories, and the whole structure stood as testament to the idea that home wasn't just a place, it was the accumulation of shared experiences and the people you chose to share them with. The story continued through spaces and times that felt adjacent to the main timeline, side adventures that filled in gaps and answered questions left hanging by the central narrative. These weren't separate stories, but rather different angles on the same universe. Moments that mattered even if they didn't fit neatly into the primary chronology, perspectives from characters whose stories deserved attention even if they weren't always central to Finn and Jake's journey. The Distant Lands era gave voice to these side stories, treated them as valuable rather than supplementary, and in doing so rounded out the understanding of what Ooo had become and what it meant to the people who called it home. BMO's adventure took them far from Ooo, into space and stranger dimensions, showing that the small robot's origins and capabilities went far beyond what anyone had fully understood. BMO traveled to the Drift, a massive space station where the last remnants of humanity lived after leaving Earth centuries ago, where people survived in the void through technology and determination and careful management of resources. Here, BMO became a hero through simple kindness and genuine care, helping people who'd forgotten what it meant to have someone believe in them, showing that heroism didn't require sword skills or stretchy powers. Sometimes it just required being present and choosing to help. The Drift's inhabitants were human, but changed by centuries in space, adapted to low gravity and artificial environments, carrying Earth memories that had become mythology rather than history. They knew about the planet their ancestors had left, but had no connection to it beyond stories and genetic heritage. BMO's arrival, carrying actual Earth experiences, actual connections to living communities rather than historical records, was like a bridge between past and present, proof that Earth still existed and still mattered, even if these space humans couldn't return to it. BMO's innocent optimism and straightforward heroism reminded the Drift's people what they'd lost in their focus on survival, inspired them to think about living rather than just not dying. The adventure concluded with BMO returning to Ooo carrying stories about space and humans and proving that the universe was even bigger and weirder than anyone had realized. The trip hadn't changed BMO fundamentally. They remained the same cheerful, imaginative, game-loving robot they'd always been. But it had given them perspective, understanding that Ooo was one small part of a vast cosmos, that the adventures around the treehouse were significant, but not the only stories worth telling, that heroism took many forms, across many places, and all of them mattered in their own contexts. Marceline and Princess Bubblegum's story got its own focus through an adventure that tested their relationship in ways the main timeline had touched on but never fully explored. They faced a threat together, something from Marceline's ancient past that resurfaced and required both her vampire abilities and Bubblegum's scientific magic to defeat. But the real story was them working through their complicated history, the centuries of friendship and hurt and distance and reconnection, finally reaching a place where they could be together without the weight of past mistakes constantly pulling them apart. The adventure took them through memories and emotions as much as physical locations, confronting moments where they'd hurt each other, times when Bubblegum's controlling nature had pushed Marceline away, instances where Marceline's fear of vulnerability had created distance when closeness was possible. They talked about Bonnibel's difficulty trusting anyone fully after centuries of being responsible for an entire kingdom, about Marceline's exhaustion with outliving everyone she cared about, and her resulting tendency to keep people at arm's length before they could die or leave. The honesty was hard but necessary, clearing space for a relationship built on who they actually were, rather than who they'd been centuries ago or who they hoped each other might become. The resolution was gentle and certain, Marceline and Bubblegum choosing each other with full knowledge of the complications and difficulties, accepting that love didn't fix fundamental personality differences but made those differences workable. That commitment meant choosing to stay even when being together was hard. They returned to Ooo as partners in ways they'd never quite managed before, still themselves, still complicated and difficult and carrying centuries of baggage, but together in ways that felt solid rather than fragile. Then came together again, the story that closed Finn and Jake's journey in the most complete way possible. Time had passed. Years, maybe decades, the exact duration unclear because the story cared more about emotional truth than chronological precision. Jake had died, passed away peacefully after a long, full life, leaving Finn to continue alone in ways that hurt more than any physical injury ever had. Finn kept adventuring, kept helping people, but everything felt hollow without his brother, without the person who'd been there for every adventure and danger and quiet moment since childhood. When Finn finally died, old and worn out, ready to rest after a lifetime of heroism, he found himself in the dead worlds, the afterlife spaces where souls went between incarnations or endings. And there he found Jake, waiting like he'd said he would, ready to continue their adventure in whatever came after life. The reunion was everything. Joy and relief, and the understanding that death wasn't an ending when it meant being with the people who mattered most. They didn't need to save the world anymore or fight cosmic threats or be heroes in any public sense. They just needed to be together, and that was enough. The dead worlds themselves were strange and varied, different spaces for different souls, opportunities for adventure without the weight of mortality or consequence. Finn and Jake explored death like they'd explored life, with enthusiasm and wonder and each other's company, proving that the bond they'd built survived everything including existence itself. They helped souls who needed helping, got into trouble that couldn't permanently hurt them, and generally continued being Finn and Jake in circumstances where being Finn and Jake was all that mattered. The story concluded with them choosing to reincarnate together, to return to life in some form, to continue their journey through new existences while maintaining the connection that had defined them across one lifetime. It was resolution without being ending, closure while leaving doors open, acknowledgement that their story was complete while also suggesting that stories like theirs never truly finish. They just transform, continue in different shapes, carry forward the love and connection that made them meaningful in the first place. In a later era of the multiverse, in dimensions adjacent to the Land of Oo's timeline, new stories emerged that echoed the old ones while standing as their own complete narratives. The Fiona and Cake reality, an alternate universe where gender-swapped versions of Oo's heroes lived out their own adventures, proved to be more than just parallel timeline curiosity. It was real in the way any dimension was real, with its own people living full lives, its own histories, and struggles and moments of triumph. deserving respect and attention rather than dismissal as derivative or secondary. But this timeline operated under different rules than the main Ooo. Where Finn and Jake's world was magical and weird by default, Fiona and Cake's world had lost its magic, become mundane and ordinary, trapped in a kind of gray normal that felt wrong precisely because it was so aggressively regular. The people here went to jobs and paid bills and dealt with everyday frustrations that had nothing to do with ancient evils or cosmic threats, living lives that felt small and constrained by the very absence of the magic that made Ooo dangerous, but also vibrant and meaningful. Simon Petrikov found himself connected to this reality through complicated magical circumstances involving his history with the Crown and Betty's transformation. He'd been living in Ooo for years since being freed from the Ice King curse, trying to build a life as an elderly mortal in a world that had moved on without him. The adjustment was hard in ways he couldn't quite articulate to people who hadn't spent centuries insane. He had decades of memories as the Ice King, actions he'd taken, and people he'd hurt while not fully himself. Guilt that couldn't be resolved because apologizing to everyone he'd wronged as the Ice King would take more time than he had left. His connection to Fiona and Cake's world came through the discovery that this reality wasn't naturally occurring, but had been created, was somehow tied to his own imagination and desires, a universe where magic existed but he himself had never been cursed, where he could see what his life might have been if things had gone differently. The realization was painful and tempting in equal measure. Here was a world that reflected his wishes, that offered him a life without the Ice King's shadow, where he could be normal and insignificant and free from the weight of his past mistakes. Fiona and Cake themselves were heroic in their own right, brave and determined, and trying to make sense of why their world felt wrong, why normalcy felt like a curse rather than a blessing. When Simon entered their reality and magic began seeping back in, when their world started resembling the adventure-filled chaos of the main Ooo, they had to decide whether they wanted that transformation or preferred the safety of mundane existence. The question was genuine. Magic brought danger and uncertainty, but it also brought possibility and meaning, the sense that life was more than just surviving until death eventually arrived. The adventure that unfolded involved traveling between realities, seeing alternate versions of Ooo where different choices had produced different outcomes, where Finn and Jake's stories had played out in variations both subtle and dramatic. Simon had to confront the reality that escaping his past wasn't possible even in other dimensions, that every universe carried echoes of trauma and difficulty, that running from himself would never work because he brought himself wherever he went. Fiona and Cake had to face the fact that wanting adventure didn't mean being prepared for its costs, that magic and danger came together, that you couldn't have the excitement without accepting the risk. The multiverse revealed itself through this journey as vast and complicated, filled with infinite variations on themes and characters, every decision creating branches where both options played out in separate continuities. Some timelines were better than the main Ooo, others were worse. Most were just different, proving that there was no objectively correct version of reality, just variations that worked differently for different people. Simon saw versions of himself where he'd never found the crown, where he'd died during the Mushroom War, where he'd stayed insane, where he'd been saved earlier or later or never. Each version offered perspective without providing answers, showing him that his life was one possibility among infinite others, but also the only one he actually had to live. The resolution involved Simon accepting that he couldn't escape his history or find alternate versions of himself to replace the person he'd actually become. He returned to the main Ooo not because it was perfect, but because it was his home, where people knew him and his complicated past, where Marceline existed and remembered both Simon and the Ice King, where his life had actual weight and meaning beyond just existing. It was choosing reality over fantasy, accepting limitation and consequence over the tempting possibility of starting fresh somewhere else where nobody knew what he'd done or who he'd been.